Rourke Bellamy didn't knock. He never knocked. He kicked open the door of the small boarding house room where Lenora Whitlock had been hiding for 3 days, grabbed her by the wrist before she could scream, and shoved her backward into the wall hard enough to rattle the window frame. Maisie, sitting on the floor with her rag doll, started crying. Bellamy didn't even look at the child. "You think you can just disappear?" His voice was quiet. That was the worst part, the quietness. "You signed those papers, Lenora. That little girl belongs to me now, legally. And if you try to run again," he leaned close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath, "I will make sure they find you in pieces." He released her wrist, straightened his coat, walked out like a man who had simply collected a debt. Lenora stood against that wall for a long time, shaking. Then she looked at Maisie, and she started packing. If you've ever had to protect someone you loved with nothing but courage and a suitcase, this story is for you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, a like means more than you know. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning Silas Mercer rode into Hollow Creek to wait for his bride was the kind of morning that felt like a promise. The sky had gone pale gold overnight. The temperature had lifted enough that a man didn't need 2 coats. And for the first time in a long while, Silas allowed himself something he wasn't accustomed to feeling: hope. He wasn't a man given to sentiment. People in Hollow Creek would have told you that plainly. He was the kind of man who showed up when a neighbor's barn burned and didn't wait to ask. The kind who repaired a fence line in silence and refused supper afterward. He worked hard, spoke little, and lived alone on a stretch of land outside town that most people considered too remote and too cold to be worth the trouble. Silas had never considered it a problem. Isolation suited a man who had learned early that relying on other people was a reliable way to get disappointed. But he was 41 years old now, and the ranch that had once felt like sanctuary had started to feel something else. He didn't have a word for it. He just knew that some evenings, sitting on the porch after the last of the chores were done, the silence came at him from all directions, like something with weight, and he'd sit with it for a while, before going inside and eating dinner standing up at the counter, because the table felt too large for one man. He'd answered the advertisement in the Territorial Gazette 6 months ago. It wasn't something he'd told anyone about. He wrote the letter at the kitchen table in the evening, rewrote it twice, threw the first 2 drafts into the stove, and sent the third before he could talk himself out of it. He described the ranch honestly: the distance from town, the harshness of winters, the work involved. He didn't inflate himself or the property. He said he was a man who would be faithful, who would not drink to excess, who would work alongside a woman rather than above her, and that was about all he could promise. He wasn't sure anyone would respond. Lenora Whitlock responded within 2 weeks. Her letters were careful at first, practical. She asked sensible questions about the water supply, the nearest school, whether the roads were passable in winter. She had a daughter, she told him, Maisie, 6 years old. She hoped that wasn't a complication he was unwilling to accept. It wasn't a complication at all, Silas wrote back. He had a spare bedroom. Over the following months, the letters changed, not dramatically. Not in any way Silas could have pointed to and said, "Here, this is the moment." But they became something he looked forward to with an urgency that embarrassed him. He found himself watching for the mail wagon on days when a letter wasn't expected. He read her words more than once. Part of its windows were dark. He started noticing things in her writing that told him more than she probably intended, the slight formality she used when she was being careful about something, the way her sentences ran long when she was excited, the dry, quiet humor buried in the corners of her paragraphs that only appeared every few letters, like she was testing whether it was safe. He thought she was probably a good woman who had been made cautious by something she hadn't told him yet. He didn't push. He figured she'd tell him when she was ready. The day she was supposed to arrive, he dressed in his better shirt, brushed the dust off his coat, and rode into Hollow Creek 4 hours early. He waited on the platform at Hollow Creek Station with the kind of stillness that made him look calmer than he was. His hat was in his hands. He'd turned it around twice already. The afternoon train arrived on time. 23 people stepped off. Silas watched every one of them. She wasn't there. He waited until the train pulled out. He checked with the station master, who told him there had been no telegram, no message of any kind. Most of its windows were dark. He walked the full length of the platform twice, as though she might have somehow stepped off without him noticing. She hadn't. The platform was empty. The train was gone. The mountains to the north sat heavy and dark against the sky. He stood there for what might have been 20 minutes, holding his hat, not knowing what to do with his face. A man named Gruber, who ran the feed store, saw him on the way back to his horse and called out that maybe she'd just thought better of it, got a look at the place and turned around. It was meant as a joke, probably. Silas didn't respond. He untied his horse, mounted up, and rode home. He fed the animals. He cooked dinner. He sat at the table and ate it for once, sitting down. Then he sat at the desk and read every one of her letters again, front to back, slowly, looking for the thing he'd missed. He didn't sleep that night. Not well. He told himself it was because of the wind a front had been building over the mountains all day, and by midnight it was rattling the shutters and sending cold air through every gap in the walls he hadn't gotten around to chinking. He lay in the dark and listened to it, and thought about a woman he had never met, and a 6-year-old girl he had never met, and whether something had simply gone wrong with a travel connection, a delayed stage, a missed junction. That happened. Those things happened all the time out here. It didn't mean anything. But he kept coming back to the last letter she'd sent, 3 weeks before the arrival date. There was something in it. He'd noticed it when he read it the first time, and then told himself he was reading too much into a few sentences. She'd said she was looking forward to starting over somewhere quiet. She'd said she hoped Maisie would take to wide open spaces. And then, near the end, almost as if she'd added it quickly, before she could reconsider, I want you to know that I mean to be entirely honest with you once we're settled. There are things I should explain in person. Please don't judge me before I've had the chance. He'd written back, saying he wasn't the judging type. He hadn't heard from her after that. By the second morning, the townsfolk had formed opinions. He heard them at the general store when he went in for supplies. Maggie Holt, who operated the post office counter, told him gently that sometimes women had second thoughts. Old Garrett Wills, who had opinions about everything and manners about nothing, said right in front of him that a mail-order arrangement was a gamble to begin with, and that a man of Silas's temperament probably hadn't sweetened the offer much. Silas bought his flour and coffee and didn't say a word to either of them. But he stood outside the store for a moment before mounting his horse. The mountains were still there, gray and solid to the north, the roads into them already looking treacherous after the night's storm. Most of its windows were dark. The pass through the high country, the route she would have taken from the railhead if her original connection had failed, was notorious even in dry weather. In a storm like the one that had just come through, it was something else entirely. He thought about a woman in a wagon, a 6-year-old girl with a rag doll. A driver who might or might not know those roads in bad weather. He went home. He thought about it until dark. Then he saddled up anyway. His neighbor, Calhoun, who lived on the adjacent property and had the unfortunate habit of appearing at inconvenient moments. Of its windows were dark, caught him loading supplies at dawn on the third day and demanded to know where he thought he was going with the mountain roads in that condition. Silas told him he was going up to Ridgeline Pass to look for a wagon that hadn't arrived. Calhoun said that was a fine way to break his neck, for a woman who probably wasn't there. Silas said he appreciated the input. He rode out at first light. The road into the mountains deteriorated within 2 hours. Not dangerously at first, just the soft, sucking kind of deterioration where the mud was deep enough to slow a horse and make every mile feel like 2. But by the time he'd climbed into the tree line and started working along the switchbacks toward the pass, the trail had become something that required more care than speed. He went slowly. He watched the ground. He watched the tree line. He watched for broken branches, wheel ruts, anything that suggested a wagon had come through here before the storm made everything worse. The light was starting to go gray and flat, in the way that preceded dusk when his horse stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The animal threw its head and planted its feet and refused to move forward, and Silas had enough respect for the instincts of a horse that had carried him through 12 winters to sit still and pay attention. He heard it first. A sound that didn't belong, high, ragged, intermittent. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something human and exhausted and small. He dismounted and worked forward through the pines on foot. The wagon was on its side about 30 yards off the trail, partially hidden by a deadfall that had come down in the storm. One wheel was still turning, almost imperceptibly, in the wind. Canvas cover had been torn half off, and what remained of the supplies had scattered across a wide radius a broken crate, a split bag of grain, a woman's shoe lying in the mud near a pine root. One shoe. Silas stopped looking at the wagon when he found the girl. She was standing against a tree trunk about 15 feet from the wreckage, holding a rag doll against her chest, wearing a wool coat 2 sizes too big for her that she'd clearly found or been put in by someone trying to keep her warm. She was shaking. Not just from cold, there was a quality to it that went deeper, the kind of shaking that happens when a body has been afraid for a very long time and doesn't quite know how to stop. She stared at him. She didn't scream. She just stared, with eyes that were too old for her face, and clutched the doll tighter. "Hey," Silas said. He stopped moving. He crouched down slowly so he wasn't looming. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't say anything. "My name's Silas. I'm looking for someone." He kept his voice even, quiet. The same voice he used with a spooked horse. "Is there a woman with you? A grown woman?" The girl looked at the wagon, found Lenora Whitlock inside the collapsed frame, unconscious, half covered by the torn canvas. She was on her side, one arm folded beneath her, a wound at her temple that had dried dark against her pale skin. Alive, he could see her breathing, shallow but steady. But her skin was cold in a way that told him she'd been out here through the night at minimum, possibly longer. He worked fast. He'd set bones and cleaned wounds and stitched cuts over the years, with no doctor within 40 miles, so he knew enough to assess without panicking. No obvious breaks in the legs, though her left shoulder was badly wrenched. The head wound looked worse than it probably was. Scalp wounds bled dramatically and healed better than they looked. Cold was the real concern. She needed warmth, and she needed it now. He went back to his horse and brought it closer, talking to Maisie the whole time in a low, steady voice, not saying anything in particular, just letting her hear that he was calm, that the situation was manageable, that he was the kind of man who did things instead of panicking. He wasn't sure how much of it she was taking in. He'd figure that out later. He wrapped windows were dark. He wrapped Lenora in his bedroll, got her positioned across the saddle as carefully as he could manage, and then looked at the little girl. "Can you walk?" Maisie looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "You'll have to hold my hand. The trail's bad." Another pause. She reached out and took his hand. It was the smallest hand he'd ever held. Started down. It took twice as long going back as it had coming up. Silas walked the horse, kept Lenora as steady as he could with one hand on her back, and kept hold of Maisie with the other. The girl didn't complain once. She stumbled twice, and both times he caught her, and both times she got up and kept walking without a sound. He wasn't sure if that was bravery or shock, and he didn't have time to figure it out. About a mile from the trailhead, Lenora stirred. Maisie. Her voice was barely a thread. Her eyes weren't fully open. "She's here," Silas said. "She's right here. She's fine." A pause. "Who are you?" Silas Mercer. Silence for a moment. Then very quietly, in a voice that sounded like it came from the bottom of a long, dark well, "You came." "I did," he said. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. They came off the mountain as the last of the light failed, and the temperature dropped hard. Silas got them to the ranch house, got Lenora inside and onto the bed in the spare room, got a fire burning in the stove until the room was genuinely warm. Maisie sat in the doorway of the bedroom and watched him work, still holding the doll, tracking every move he made with those careful, measuring eyes. He found her a blanket. He heated water. He made something that he called stew, which was honestly just broth with what he could find in the pantry, but it was hot, and there was enough of it. Put a bowl on the table for her. She came to the table, sat down, looked at the bowl. Is my mama going to be all right? Thought about lying. He was not actually sure yet, but there was something about those eyes that made him think she'd know the difference. Think so, he said, but I'm not a doctor. I'm going to do everything I can. Picked up the spoon, ate. He went back to Lenora. It was well past midnight when he found the envelope. It had fallen from her coat when he'd carefully removed it to examine her injuries, and he hadn't noticed it until he was hanging the coat by the stove to dry. It was crumpled and damp, sealed, with the ink slightly blurred from moisture. His name was on the front. Silas Mercer. Her handwriting. He held it for a moment. Then he set it on the table without opening it, went back to check on her, and sat down in the wooden chair beside the bed to wait for morning. He could read it when she was awake. He could read it when she could look him in the eye. Outside, the wind had dropped. The mountains were quiet. Maisie had fallen asleep on the cot he'd set up near the stove, the rag doll tucked under her chin, one small hand curled against her cheek. Silas leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. He thought about a platform, about holding his hat and turning it twice in his hands, about 23 people stepping off a train and none of them being the right one. He thought about a 6-year-old hand in his. He thought about a woman who had almost frozen to death trying to reach him, not out of obligation, not because she had no other choice, but because she had chosen. He didn't fully know that yet, not all of it. The envelope would tell him things that would change everything, and the weeks ahead would be harder and more dangerous than anything the mountain had already thrown at them. But sitting in the firelight, listening to Lenora breathe steadily in the next room, and Maisie sleep quietly near the stove, Silas Mercer felt something settle in his chest that had been restless and untethered for a very long time. He didn't have a name for it yet. He'd figure that out later, too. He read the letter at dawn. He hadn't planned to. He'd told himself he would wait until Lenora was awake, until she could sit across from him and say the words herself, rather than letting him absorb them alone at a kitchen table with cold coffee and the sound of Maisie's small, even breathing coming from the other room. That had been the plan. But somewhere around 4 in the morning, when the fire had burned down to coals and Lenora's breathing had steadied into something that sounded genuinely like sleep rather than unconsciousness, Silas had gotten up, poured the last of the coffee, sat down at the table, and picked up the envelope. He told himself he just wanted to understand what he was dealing with. That was probably half true. The letter was 4 pages, written close and careful in her handwriting, the same handwriting he'd been reading for 6 months. But this wasn't the handwriting of the woman who'd told him about water tables and school distances and whether Maisie was old enough to help with small chores. This was different, tighter. Like every sentence had been composed and reconsidered and written again before she'd let herself put it down permanently. She started by apologizing. Not for missing the train, that explanation came later, and it was not what he'd expected. She apologized for not telling him sooner, for letting him build a picture of her life that was missing the most important pieces. She wrote that she had tried 3 separate times in previous letters to tell him the truth, and had deleted it all, because she was afraid of what he would do with the information. Afraid he'd say it was too complicated, too dangerous, that he hadn't signed up for trouble, and that she and Maisie would be back where they started. She wrote that she understood if that was still his reaction, reading this now. Then she told him about Rourke Bellamy. Silas read it slowly. He read some parts twice. He was not a man who swore often, but somewhere in the middle of the 3rd page, he said something under his breath that he wouldn't have said in company. Bellamy was a land broker who operated across 3 territories, and on the surface, he was exactly what he appeared to be: prosperous, well-connected, the kind of man who donated to local causes and got his name on buildings and sat in the front pew wherever he went. Lenora had met him 2 years after her husband died, when she was still living on the small property she and her first husband had built together, struggling to manage it alone with a 4-year-old and no real income. Bellamy had appeared offering help. Loans at first with reasonable terms. Then more loans, with terms that were explained quickly and signed faster than she should have allowed. Then he had started coming around more often than the business arrangements required. And something about the way he looked at Maisie, not with warmth, nothing as human as warmth, had started making the back of Lenora's neck go cold. She'd started reading the documents she'd signed more carefully. Too late to undo the damage, but not too late to understand it. The debts Bellamy claimed she owed him were real. In the technical sense, she had signed papers. They existed, but they had been structured in a way no honest lender would construct them, with terms that compounded faster than any working ranch could generate income to meet, with clauses she hadn't understood buried in language designed to obscure. And one document, the one she hadn't looked at closely enough at the time, contained language about guardianship. about what happened to the assets and dependents of a borrower who defaulted. Maisie wasn't an asset, she was a child. But on that paper, in Bellamy's careful legal construction, she might as well have been one. When Lenora had confronted him about it, he hadn't been angry. That was what she wrote, and Silas could hear the particular terror in the sentence. He hadn't been angry. He'd been calm. He'd explained, in the quiet, pleasant voice of a man how was accustomed to getting what he wanted, that she had two choices. She could accept his ongoing assistance, which would involve a different kind of arrangement than a business loan, or she could default, at which point he would pursue every legal avenue available to him, including the guardianship clause, because he had a judge in 3 counties who would see things his way. She'd packed that night. She hadn't been able to take much, just what fit in a single trunk. Maisie's things, the documents she'd managed to collect over 2 years of careful reading, and a rag doll that Maisie refused to travel without under any circumstances. She'd found the advertisement from Silas. She'd already been looking for some way out. She wrote, and the advertisement had been there, and he had seemed in his letters like the kind of man who would not be easily intimidated, and she had been desperate and frightened, and she knew she was being dishonest by omission, and she was sorry. She was sorry. He set the letter down on the table and sat with it for a while. The fire had gone cold. He got up and rebuilt it, feeding small pieces first, then larger ones, the way you always had to. You couldn't start with the big logs. You had to build up to them. He stood there until he was sure it had caught. Then he went to check on Lenora. She was barely. Her eyes were open and tracking, but there was a heaviness to her gaze that told him she was working hard just to stay conscious. The bruising around her temple had darkened overnight, and her left arm was bound against her chest with the improvised sling he'd made from a linen shirt he'd cut up around midnight. She looked at him from the pillow without moving her head. "You read it," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I did." She waited. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I know. I'm not saying that to make you feel worse than you already do. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I don't think either of us benefits from pretending it isn't." She closed her eyes briefly. "Are you going to ask us to leave?" He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "You're not leaving anywhere in your condition. That's just a medical fact. So let's set aside. Silas." Let me finish. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation. He could feel himself reaching for words that didn't come easily to him, the same way you reached for a tool in a dark room, by memory, by feel. "I read what you wrote, all of it, and I understand why you didn't tell me. I don't like it, but I understand it. You didn't know me well enough to know what I'd do with the information. That's fair." She was looking at him. He couldn't quite read her expression. Pain, yes, and exhaustion, but something else, the same careful, measuring quality he'd heard in her letters. She was deciding whether to trust what he was saying. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Right now, I'm going to make you something to eat and check that shoulder. After that, we'll figure out the rest." "He'll come here," she said. Her voice didn't waver, but her hand tightened on the blanket. "He's not the kind of man who lets things go." "I expect not," Silas said. "But he's not here yet." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then something in her face shifted slightly, not quite relief. Not as simple as that, but something that had been braced against impact, easing just fractionally. Like a door that had been held shut from the inside with both hands, and someone on the other side had finally stopped pushing. "The documents," she said. "I kept them. They're in the trunk, the small one. It came through the wreck. Maisie kept it with her." He nodded. "We'll look at them when you're stronger." "We need to look at them now." He looked at her. "Silas, I know what I look like, but I've been thinking about those papers for 2 years. I know what's in them. And if Bellamy figures out where I've gone, time matters more than my shoulder." He thought about arguing. He decided not to. She wasn't wrong. Most of its windows were dark. Maisie was awake when he came out of the bedroom, sitting at the kitchen table with her doll, watching the door. She had helped herself to a piece of bread from the cloth he'd left it under, which he took as an encouraging sign. She watched him cross to the cot where he'd stacked her things the night before, and when he lifted the small trunk and carried it to the table, she got very still. "Is that Mama's?" she said. "It is. She asked me to get it." Maisie looked at the trunk, then at him. "Is she going to be all right now? You said you thought so, but that was last night. She's awake and talking. That's a good sign. Can I see her? In a little while. Let me bring her breakfast first. He hadn't thought of himself as someone who knew how to manage a child. He didn't have experience with it, not directly. But Maisie, he was finding, wasn't a child who required management so much as a child who required honesty. She asked direct questions, and she listened carefully to the answers. And the fastest way to lose her trust was to speak to her in the softened, rounded way some adults used with children, as though reality needed to be sanded down before it was safe for small hands. She didn't want sanding down. She wanted to know what was true. He brought the trunk to the tark. He brought the trunk to the bedroom, and the three of them spent the better part of 2 hours going through it. Lenora directed from the pillow, telling him which documents to pull and in what order, explaining what each one meant, pointing out the specific language that Bellamy had buried in the longer agreements. He had brought a sheet of paper and wrote notes as she talked. Maisie sat on the foot of the bed with her doll, quiet but clearly listening, in the way children listened when they understood that something important was happening, even if they couldn't follow every word. The picture that emerged was ugly. Not simple, not clean, but ugly in the methodical, deliberate way that was somehow worse than impulsive cruelty. Bellamy hadn't done this to Lenora out of passion or anger. He'd done it as a system. The loans, the compound interest, the guardianship clause, it was a mechanism, a way of acquiring things. And Lenora, a widowed woman with a small child and limited legal knowledge, had been exactly the kind of target the mechanism was designed for. But she had also been paying attention for 2 years. The documents she'd managed to collect included copies of property records she had formally requested, correspondence she had saved rather than discarded, and, crucially, 2 different versions of one particular agreement, the original she'd been shown, and a revised version she'd discovered later that contained alterations she had never agreed to and never signed. The signatures on the revised version, Lenora told him, were not hers, though they were meant to look like it. Silas examined both versions side by side. He was not a lawyer, but he had spent enough years reading contracts for land and livestock to know what a consistent signature looked like, and these were not consistent. "This is forgery," he said. "Yes," Lenora said. "Do you have any other copies of things you signed that show your actual signature?" 3. At the bottom of the stack, he found them, held them up against the falsified document. The difference was not dramatic. Whoever had done it had been reasonably skilled, but it was there. The angle of the capital L, the way she crossed the final K. Small things, consistent things, things that couldn't be faked perfectly because the faker hadn't had enough examples to study. "This is enough," he said. Not to her exactly. More to himself, thinking out loud. "Enough for what?" Maisie asked. Both adults looked at her. Silas had almost forgotten she was there, which made him feel briefly guilty. "Enough to get some help," he said. Over the days that followed, a rough, imperfect routine established itself at Mercer Ranch. Lenora was up and moving by the 3rd day, though Silas told her twice a day that she was moving too much, and she ignored him both times with the patient, slightly exasperated expression of a woman who had survived worse than a sore shoulder and did not need to be managed. Her color came back faster than he'd expected. She had a constitution that matched the directness of her letters. It turned out she didn't recover gracefully. She recovered stubbornly, pushing against her own limitations with a relentlessness that was at times impressive and at times a genuine nuisance. Maisie was a different problem. The physical recovery, such as it was scrapes, bruising, the bone-deep exhaustion of a child who had been scared and cold for too long, resolved fairly quickly. It was everything else that lingered. She slept lightly and woke at unfamiliar sounds. She watched the windows in a way that a 6-year-old should not have occasion to watch windows. Every time a horse came up the road, however distant, she went completely still and didn't move until the sound had passed. And her mother had said something to her, quietly, that brought her back. Silas didn't know what to do about it exactly. He wasn't sure anyone knew what to do about it. It was the kind of damage that didn't have a simple fix, that was going to take time and steadiness and the gradual accumulation of days when nothing terrible happened. So he focused on what he could provide, which was exactly that, days when nothing terrible happened. He showed her how to check the water levels in the troughs. He showed her where the feed was kept. He gave her small jobs, not because he needed the help, but because he understood from his own experience, from years, of knowing that the best remedy for a mind that kept circling back to bad things was to give the hands something concrete to do that purposeful work, was one of the few things that actually helped. She was serious about the jobs, remarkably serious for a 6-year-old. She did not do anything halfway. On the 4th morning, she found him in the barn before breakfast, which surprised him because it was early and cold, and she'd had no reason to be out there. She stood in the barn doorway in her too big coat, the doll under one arm, and watched him work for a moment before she said, "Why did you come for us?" Kept working. "Because your mother didn't arrive, and I wanted to know why. Most people wouldn't have. Old Mr. Terrell, he was our neighbor back home. He said women who leave don't deserve to be looked for." Silas thought about what he wanted to say and what he actually believed. Old Mr. Terrell sounds like a damn fool. Maisie looked at him with an expression that was startlingly close to amusement. "Mama says I'm not supposed to use that kind of language." "Your mama's right, don't repeat that." "I won't." A pause. "But I thought the same thing about Mr. Terrell." He almost smiled. He didn't quite get there, but it was close. Ladora was at the kitchen table. When he came back inside, the document spread in front of her, and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow in the way that coffee always seemed to go cold when she was working, because she forgot to drink it. Most of its windows were dark. She looked up when he came in, and he could tell by the set of her expression that she'd been thinking about something she wasn't sure how to say. "There's a territorial marshal," she said. "Out of Billings, I think. Someone mentioned his name to me once, Haskell. Apparently he's been trying to build a case against Bellamy for a while." "Where'd you hear that?" "One of the other women Bellamy targeted. She tried to fight back 2 years ago and got nowhere because she didn't have the documents. But she told me about Haskell." Lenora tapped the stack of papers. "If he's still there, if he's still working this, these documents might matter to him too. Not just as my case, as part of something larger." Silas sat down across from her. He thought about it. "You'd have to trust a lawman you've never met with evidence that is the only real protection you and Maisie have." "I know, if something went wrong with that." "I know, Silas." She wasn't sharp about it, but she was firm. "I've been running from this for 8 months. I'm tired of running. I want to fight it. I need to know if there's a way to fight it." He looked at her across the table. She looked back at him. The bruising on her temple had faded from purple to green and yellow, and her arm was out of the sling now, though she still favored it, and the rest of its windows were dark, and there was something in her face that had changed since the first morning, since the letter, since the documents, since 3 days of slow, careful conversation in which neither of them had said everything they might have said, but had said more than he was accustomed to saying to anyone. She wasn't the woman from the letters anymore, or rather she was, but with the missing pieces filled in, and the result was something more complicated and more real. She wasn't easy to know. She was worth knowing. "All right," he said. "I'll ride to Billings." She started to say something. He held up a hand. "Not tomorrow. Not until I'm satisfied you're not about to fall over. A few more days." She pressed her mouth together like she was considering arguing. Then she nodded. Those few days were not quiet ones, though the trouble that was smaller than what either of them was bracing for. On the 5th day, a man named Pruitt from the nearest neighboring ranch 7 miles east came riding up to tell Silas that a stranger had been asking questions in Hollow Creek about a woman and a child who might have recently passed through. Pruitt was a laconic man, not given to alarm, but he had the particular look of someone who had decided that his neighbor deserved to know something unpleasant, and he delivered it without embellishment. The stranger had described Lenora well enough that a few people in town had connected it to Silas's search, and one of them, Pruitt, didn't say who, though his expression suggested he had an opinion, had mentioned the name Mercer and the direction of the ranch. Silas thanked him, stood in the yard, and watched him ride away. Then he went inside. "How fast?" he said to Lenora. "Can you show me everything in those documents that you think a lawyer would consider significant?" She looked at him. She understood. "An hour, maybe less." "Then let's start now." They spent the rest of that day and most of the evening going through everything again, this time with Silas asking specific questions and Lenora answering them, and him writing everything down in a careful summary that he folded and put in the inner pocket of his coat. The original documents he wrapped in oilcloth and put in the iron box. He kept bolted to the floor under the floorboards in the back of the bedroom, not invisible to a determined search, but not immediately obvious either. Maisie, he noticed, helped him nail the floorboard back down without being asked. She handed him the hammer without speaking, like it was simply obvious that this was something that needed doing. And then she went and stood by the window and watched the road. He did not sleep well that night. Not because he was afraid, or not exactly because of that. He was under no illusions about Rourke Bellamy. A man who had built that kind of operation didn't pursue a fleeing woman with hired muscle because he genuinely loved the child or felt cheated out of a legal debt. He pursued her because she had documents, and he knew it. And a woman with those documents and the right audience was a problem that threatened everything he'd built. The danger was not theoretical. But what kept Silas awake wasn't fear so much as the particular kind of alertness that precedes a confrontation you know is coming and can't prevent, only prepare for. He lay there running through things he could control, the routes to the ranch, the men nearby who he knew well enough to call on. A package of documents copied and distributed. That was something he should have thought of sooner, multiple copies in multiple places so that destroying one set didn't destroy the case. He got up at 3 a.m. and wrote 3 copies by hand, using the summary he'd already made as his guide. His handwriting was bad, and it took longer than it should have, but he finished all 3 before the sky started going gray. He put 1 copy in the iron box with the originals. Put Sexton in an envelope addressed to the territorial marshal's office in Billings, which he would post from town. The 3rd copy he folded inside a letter to Calhoun, his nearest neighbor, with a note asking him to keep it safe and not ask questions about it yet. He was going to ask Lenora before he did any of this. That was his intention. But the morning caught him before he could, and by the time she was up looking steadier, looking like herself, the way she moved across the kitchen already telling him that whatever today brought, she would meet it. Standing up, he had the copies done and the envelopes sealed, and she was standing at the stove when he came in with them. She looked at the envelopes. She looked at him. "You made copies," she said. 3. 1 to Billings, 1 to Calhoun, 1 stays here. She was quiet for a moment. "You should have asked me." "I should have. I decided not to wait." She turned back to the stove, stirred whatever was in the pot. "I'm not angry," she said after a moment. "I just want you to know that it's my decision to make. My case. My daughter." "You're right," he said. "It won't happen again without telling you first." Another moment of quiet. "Then the letters you said you'd been writing. Back and forth, did you save any of mine?" "All of them." She paused. "Why?" He didn't have an easy answer for that. "'Cause I liked reading them." She turned around then and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was neither the careful, guarded look she'd worn for the first few days, nor anything he could quite categorize. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. Something that had seen trouble and was still capable of warmth anyway. "You're a strange man, Silas Mercer," she said. "I've been told. I don't mean it badly." "I know," he said. Maisie appeared in the doorway from the bedroom, hair a disaster, doll under her arm, and looked between the two of them with the expression of a child evaluating a situation she didn't fully understand, but was tracking closely. "Is something happening?" she asked. "Breakfast is happening," Lenora said. "Go wash your face." Maisie looked at Silas. He nodded slightly, confirming that breakfast was in fact the primary current event. She retreated. He heard water splashing. In the days that followed, a different kind of change settled into the ranch, quieter than the immediate crisis, but more persistent. Lenora started doing things without being asked, not from obligation. He didn't think, but from the kind of practical, unsentimental helpfulness that belonged to a person who saw what needed doing and did it. She went through the pantry and reorganized it in a way that made things easier to find, which he pretended not to notice, but immediately appreciated. She looked at the account book he kept on the shelf and pointed out without any preamble that he had been calculating one of his feed costs incorrectly for at least 2 seasons, losing money on every purchase. He checked her figures. She was right. He didn't know whether to be annoyed or grateful, so he settled on both. They were careful with each other in a way that wasn't coldness, but wasn't familiarity either. The letters had created a kind of intimacy before they'd ever met. And then the emergency of the first days had compressed them into a closeness that skipped over the normal awkwardness of strangers becoming acquainted. And now that the emergency had eased slightly, there was a quality to the space between them that was neither the distance of strangers nor the ease of people who knew each other well, something in between. Something seemed being carefully constructed from both sides, with both of them aware that there was more at stake here than ordinary social discomfort. She caught him, one evening, whittling. It was a habit he'd had since his 20s, something he did in the evenings when his hands needed to be doing something while his mind sorted through whatever it was sorting through. He'd been working on a small wooden horse for about a week, in the minutes before bed, and he'd forgotten it was sitting on the table until Lenora came in from checking on Maisie and saw it. She picked it up, turned it over. The carving was decent. Not fine work. He wasn't a craftsman, but the proportions were right, and the grain of the wood was nice. A piece of pine he'd found in the scrap pile with a good straight line to it. "Is this for Maisie?" she asked. Thought she might like something to go with the doll. Lenora looked at the little horse for a moment, and he saw her throat move. She set it back down very carefully, as though it was more fragile than wood. "She'd love it," she said. Her voice was even. "She's obsessed with horses. She used to climb the fence to pet the neighbor's horses back home. Scared me half to death every time. I'll finish it tomorrow." "You don't have to." "I know I don't," he said. She looked at him then, the way she'd looked at him a few times now, with that quality of reassessment, of matching the person in front of her against some interior picture, and finding that the two things didn't quite line up the way she'd expected. He wasn't sure what picture she'd had. Probably something simpler. A man who'd answered an advertisement and had a spare bedroom and decent soil. She wasn't simple, and she didn't seem to be looking for simple. But she was still deciding what she was looking for, he thought. Still deciding whether she was allowed to want something that wasn't just safety. "I owe you an honest answer," she said suddenly. He waited. "You asked me in one of your letters. You asked why I chose your advertisement specifically, out of all the ones I'd looked at." She paused. "I told you it was the location, the remoteness. And that was true partly. But the real reason was something you wrote in the third paragraph." "What did I write?" "You wrote, 'I am not looking for someone to complete me. I have been complete for a long time. I am looking for someone to build something with.'" She stopped. "Every other letter I read said something about wanting a partner or a companion or a helpmate. Fine things, but you said build, like it was a project. Like it was going to be hard and require planning and take longer than expected and might not come out the way you'd drawn it, but you were going to show up every day and work on it anyway." She looked at the table. "That's the only kind of thing I've ever trusted." He didn't say anything for a moment. "I do remember writing that," he said finally. "Did you mean it?" "I don't write things I don't mean." She nodded slowly. Not dramatically. Just registered it. Stored it somewhere. "There's going to be more trouble," she said. "Before this is over, a man like Bellamy doesn't stop because a rancher in Montana tells him to." "No," Silas said. "He'll need a better reason than that." "Do we have one?" "We're working on it." She nodded again. Picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway, with the uncomplaining practicality of a woman who had stopped waiting for things to be ideal. Silas thought there was something quietly remarkable about that, about the specific kind of toughness that didn't announce itself, that just got up in the morning and drank cold coffee and kept going. He thought about the envelope he'd sent to Billings, about the copies in the iron box, about Calhoun, who was a steady man and would ask no questions, about the neighboring ranchers he'd worked alongside for years, who he hadn't called on in this yet, but could, about the fact that Bellamy, for all his lawyers and his judges and his hired men, was coming onto ground that Silas knew, and Bellamy didn't. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Not storming just the ordinary Montana wind that came every evening, restless and cold, and carrying the smell of pine from the high country. The mountains were still there, dark shapes against the darkening sky. Maisie appeared in the doorway. For the second time that evening, in her nightclothes, feet bare on the cold floor, the doll hanging from one hand. "I heard you talking," she said. "Is the bad man coming?" Lenora and Silas looked at each other. "Not tonight," Silas said. But eventually, he thought about what he'd decided earlier, about honesty with her, about sanded-down reality not being what she needed or what she trusted. "We don't know yet," he said, "but if he does, were going to be ready. Maisie considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to everything. What do I do if he comes? You stay inside, away from windows, and you stay with your mama. That's your job. That's not much of a job. It's the most important one, he said. I need to know where you both are, always. If I don't know, I can't do my job. Understand? She thought about it, gave a single firm nod like she was agreeing to terms. Then she looked at the table and spotted the wooden horse. She went still. Is that a horse? It will be when it's finished. She looked at him, back at the horse, back at him. Can I hold it? He pushed it across the table toward her. She picked it up with both hands and turned it over slowly, running her thumb along the curve of the neck. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, not in the way things shifted in stories, but in the small, specific way of a child who has been bracing for a long time and has just been given something that doesn't require bracing for. She held it for a while. Neither adult said anything. Then she put it carefully back on the table, in the same spot she'd taken it from, and padded back to the bedroom without another word. Lenora watched the empty doorway for a moment. When she turned back to the table, her eyes were bright, but her expression was composed, in the way of a woman practiced at not letting things undo her in front of other people. 3 riders, she said. Silas frowned. What? That's what I'm waiting for. She wrapped her hands around her cold cup. Bellamy always sends 2 men ahead and comes himself third. That's his pattern. Every time he's shown up somewhere to collect on a debt, the women I spoke to describe the same thing. 3 riders. She met his eyes. When you see 3 riders, that's them. Silas looked at her. He thought about the road visible from the kitchen window, the long straight approach from the east that gave you a clear line of sight for half a mile in good weather. He thought about the ridge to the north, where the land rose and a man on horseback would be visible against the skyline before he got close. All right, he said. He started that night to think about what he was going to do when 3 riders came over that ridge. Because they were coming, both of them understood that. Not as fear exactly, but as weather, as the kind of inevitability you accounted for and prepared for, rather than hoping it wouldn't arrive. Bellamy had built his operation on the assumption that the people he threatened had nowhere to turn and no one who would stand beside them. He had been right about that, consistently for years. He had not yet met a situation where he was wrong about it. That was about to change. The envelope from Billings arrived on a Tuesday. Silas had been watching for it, without telling Lenora he was watching for it, which was a minor dishonesty he justified to himself by deciding that there was no point raising expectations until there was something concrete to raise them about. The mail came to Hollow Creek twice a week, carried by a driver named Pickett, who was reliable in the way that mattered and not reliable in others, meaning he would always deliver your letter, but might also mention its return address to anyone who asked, which was a character flaw Silas had cataloged and was now actively accounting for. The letter was from the marshal's office, not from Marshal Haskell, directly from a deputy named Connell, writing on official letterhead in the careful contractual language of a man who had been trained to commit as little as possible to paper. But the meaning was clear enough. The documents Silas had forwarded were of significant interest. Someone would be in contact. The matter was being taken under consideration by parties with authority to act. It was not a promise. It was not even close to a guarantee. But it was something. And something was more than they'd had a week ago. He read it twice on the road back from town, holding the reins with one hand, which he normally didn't do. Then he folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and thought about how to tell Lenora. Not the fact of it, he wasn't going to withhold that again, not after their conversation about the copies. He meant the tone of it. How to give her the information without inflating and without letting either of them start believing they were safer than they were. Its windows were dark. She was in the yard when he got back, hanging washing on the line he'd strung the house and the old fence post near the water trough. Her arm was still bothering her. He could tell she favored it in small ways she wasn't aware of, reaching for things with the right hand first, turning her body to compensate. She looked up when he rode in, and before he'd even dismounted, she said, "You have something." He handed her the letter. She read it standing right there in the yard, with the washing half hung and the wind pulling at the edge of the paper. When she finished, she read it again. He watched her face, which was very still in the way her face went still. when she was processing something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. "He's real," she said finally. "Haskell is real, and he's been working this. That's what it looks like." She looked at the letter again. "It says someone will be in contact. That could mean weeks." It could. "Bellamy won't wait weeks." "No," Silas said. "He won't." She handed the letter back to him and went back to the washing. He stood there for a moment, because there was something he needed to say, and he was working out how to say this without making it sound like more than it was or less than it was. "I'm going to talk to some of the neighboring ranchers," he said. She paused. "What are you going to tell them?" "The truth. That I've got a situation developing at my place. That I might need some people I trust nearby for a particular day." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that for us." "I'm not doing it for you," he said. "I'm doing it because I want Bellamy to see, when he gets here, that there are people watching. That he's not walking onto an isolated property with one man and two women he can threaten into silence. I want him to understand the situation has changed before he opens his mouth." She thought about this. He could see her thinking about it, the particular quality of focus she brought to any problem. The same focus she'd brought to the documents, to the account book, to everything she'd decided deserved her full attention. "He'll see it as a challenge," she said. "He's not the kind of man who backs down when he's embarrassed in front of people." "I'm counting on that," Silas said. She looked at him. "You want him to threaten us in front of witnesses. Everything he does after he arrives here is evidence. The marshal's office said they were interested. Evidence is what they need." He paused. "And if he's standing in my yard telling a woman to hand over her daughter with half a dozen men watching, he has not a powerful land broker anymore. He's just someone doing something ugly in front of people who have eyes." She held his gaze for a long moment. "That's a risk," she said. "Yes, a considerable one." "Yes." Another pause. The wind moved through the yard, rattling the washing on the line. A horse shifted in the corral. These were the sounds of ordinary life, the sounds that had surrounded Silas for years, and that now carried a different weight because they were shared sounds, not solitary ones, and that distinction had crept up on him without announcement. "All right," she said. "He went to see Calhoun that afternoon." Calhoun was not a man who asked unnecessary questions, which was one of the reasons Silas had trusted him with a copy of the documents. He listened to what Silas told him, the shortened version, the practical outline, without everything that was still private, and he said, with the flat, unhurried assurance of a man who had been on this land for 30 years and had seen various kinds of trouble come and go, "Tell me when, and I'll be there." Over the following 4 days, Silas visited 6 other men. Not all of them were ranchers. 2 were farmers. One was a retired army man named Durant, who now kept sheep and had opinions about everything from territorial law to the quality of local timber. They were all men he had worked alongside, or helped or been helped by, over the accumulation of years that built the quiet, unspoken ledger of frontier community. He didn't ask them to fight. He didn't ask them to threaten anyone. He asked them to be present, to watch, to be witnesses to whatever Bellamy arrived intending to do. Every one of them said yes. Durant specifically said it in a way that told Silas he'd been waiting for someone to give him a reason to say it. Most were dark. There were things about Bellamy that had been murmured about in the community for longer than Silas had known the Hendersons, who'd lost their north pasture 2 years ago under circumstances no one fully understood, the Birch widow, who'd sold her property for 1/3 of its value and moved to stay with family in another territory because staying had become untenable. Nobody had connected these things explicitly, had named them as a pattern, because Bellamy was careful and because there was no single act you could point to that was undeniably criminal rather than just ruthless. But the murmuring existed. The community remembered, and men like Durant didn't forget. Silas came home on the 4th afternoon to find Maisie in the barn. Not in trouble, she was just sitting in the hay near the horse stalls with her doll and the wooden horse he'd finished 2 days ago, arranging the two of them in a configuration that seemed to have its own internal logic. She looked up when he came in and then went back to what she was doing without particular urgency. "Your mother know you're out here," he said. I told her. He unsaddled his horse, working through the familiar routine, aware of her quiet presence nearby. She was good at being quiet. Not suppressed quiet, the way some children went quiet when they were scared of saying the thing, more like naturally quiet. A child who was comfortable enough in her own company that she didn't feel the need to fill silence with noise. After a while, she said, "Mr. Silas." He had told her she didn't need the mister. She'd reverted to it anyway, consistently, and he'd stopped correcting it. What? When the bad man comes, the one Mama's scared of, she paused, choosing her words with the deliberateness she always used. Will you be scared too? He thought about lying. He'd been doing that calculus with her a lot lately, truth versus the softened version, and he kept landing in the same place. Probably, he said. She seemed to consider this seriously. Papa used to say only stupid people aren't scared of things. It was the first time she'd mentioned her father. Silas kept his voice and expressions even, because he understood that this was the kind of thing that could close up fast if it felt like it was being made into something large. Your papa sounds like a smart man, he said. A pause. He died when I was 4. I don't really remember his face, just that he smelled like cedar. She looked down at the wooden horse in her hand. The horse smells like cedar. Silas had not chosen the wood for any particular reason. He had used a piece of pine with the good grain that had been sitting in the scrap pile. He did not say this. Good wood for carving, he said. She turned the horse over once, and then held it carefully, the way she'd been holding it since he gave it to her, like it was something worth taking care of. He went back to his work and didn't say anything else. And neither did she, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that didn't require filling. He thought about cedar. He thought about a 4-year-old who had lost her father and a 6-year-old who was still carrying that loss, a stone, and in her pocket, not complaining about it, not asking anyone to acknowledge it, just quietly carrying it. He understood that specific weight, not from the same direction, but from having carried it himself in his own way for his own reasons. He didn't mention it to Lenora, but that evening, after Maisie had gone to bed, when Lenora was at the table going through the documents again, she went through them regularly, making sure she could speak to each one without hesitation if she needed to. He said, "She mentioned her father today." Lenora looked up. Briefly, he said, she wasn't upset. "I just thought you'd want to know." Lenora looked back at the papers. She does that sometimes. Out of nowhere, just drops it in, and then moves on. She smoothed the edge of a document with her thumb. I used to try to say the right thing when she did it, make it into a moment. She never wanted that. So now I just let her say it and move on with her. That sounds right, he said. I don't always know what's right with her. She said it simply, without drama. She's not a simple child. She never has been. No, he said. She's not. The look they exchanged then had something in it that they hadn't put into words yet, and that neither of them tried to put into words now. It was enough that it was there. The 3 riders appeared on the morning of the 14th day. Silas saw them from the kitchen window while he was standing at the counter with his second cup of coffee. He saw them before they were even fully over the ridge, 3 figures on horseback, still at the limit of what he could make out clearly, most of its windows, but the silhouette ending of them hit him in the chest with a physical sensation he would not have anticipated. Not fear exactly, something colder. Clarity. He set his cup down. Maisie was at the table eating. Lenora was behind him, moving toward the stove, kept his voice completely level. Lenora. She heard it. Whatever tone or quality was in that single word, she heard it, because she stopped moving immediately. How many? 3. 1 second? Maybe 2. All right, she said. Take Maisie and go to the back room. Stay away from the front windows. If you hear anything that worries you, you come to the bedroom doorway and you stay there. Don't come out into the main room unless I call you. He was already moving toward the door, reaching for his coat on the hook. Lenora came to the table, put her hands on Maisie's shoulders. Come on, Bug. Maisie looked at Silas. There was that expression again. Old, steady, accounting for something. Is it him? We don't know yet, Silas said. Go with your mama. Do your job. She got up from the table without another word, her doll and her wooden horse both in her hands. He watched them go down the hall. Then he went outside. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of morning that made everything visible, no haze, no cloud cover, just flat gray-blue sky and the clear lines of the ranch laid out in front of him. The riders were coming down the road now, close enough to distinguish. 2 he didn't know hired men, by the look of them, the kind of men who were paid to make situations easier for the man they worked for. 3rd was in front. Silas had never seen Rourke Bellamy before. He had formed a picture from Lenora's description, and the reality matched it closely enough to be unsettling. A well-dressed man in his 50s, heavy through the shoulders, sitting his horse with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this particular errand many times and had never once been surprised by the outcome. His coat was good. His boots were good. He had the appearance, carefully maintained, of a prosperous man on a routine piece of business. He pulled up about 20 feet from where Silas was standing. "Morning," he said. Pleasant, like a man who had stopped to ask for directions. "I'm looking for the Mercer property." "You found it," Silas said. Bellamy looked at him with the quick, assessing look of a man who was perpetually taking mesure of people. "You'd be Silas Mercer, I would." Rourke Bellamy. He didn't offer a hand. Neither did Silas. "I have some business to conduct with a woman named Lenora Whitlock. I understand she may be a guest of yours." "She's not a guest," Silas said. "She lives here." Something moved through Bellamy's expression, brief and controlled. "Is that right?" "That's right." "Well." He shifted in the saddle, a small adjustment of someone repositioning himself for a longer conversation than he'd expected. "I have legal documents pertaining to a debt obligation she entered into, as well as a guardianship matter involving her daughter. I'd like to speak with her." "She's not available." "Mr. Mercer." The pleasantness in his voice developed an edge, careful and precise as a scalpel. "I'm not asking for permission. These are legal matters." "I have the documentation, so do I," Silas said. Bellamy paused. "I've had a fair amount of time to go through everything Mrs. Whitlock brought with her," Silas said, "including 2 different versions of your debt agreement, the original and the revised one." He paused. "The signatures on the revised one aren't hers." Nothing in Bellamy's face moved. That was, Silas thought, the most telling thing, the absolute absence of surprise, which meant this was not new information to him, which meant he knew exactly what he'd done. "I'm not sure what you think you've found," Bellamy said, "but document interpretation is a matter for lawyers, not ranchers." "Agreed," Silas said. "That's why I sent copies to the Territorial Marshal's office in Billings 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was brief but substantial. One of Bellamy's hired men shifted. The other one was very still. Bellamy himself had not changed expression, but something had changed around his eyes, a quality of recalculation. Like a man who had walked into a room expecting it to be empty and was processing the fact that it was not. "You're interfering in a legal matter," Bellamy said, and now the pleasantness was completely gone, replaced by something flat and deliberate. "That's a significant step, Mr. Mercer. I'd suggest you think carefully about whether you understand the implications." "I've thought about it," Silas said. "I have attorneys who—" "I'm sure you do. Who will make this considerably more complicated for you than you're anticipating." "Probably," Silas said. "I'm not particularly worried about complicated." Bellamy looked at him. The measuring look had returned, but it was different now. Not the quick assessment of a powerful man categorizing an obstacle. Something more careful. Something that was still calculating, but had revised the numbers. "Where is the woman?" he said. "Inside. I want to speak with her." "She doesn't want to speak with you." "I don't require her to want it." His voice had dropped into something very quiet. "I require her to comply with a legal obligation. If she won't do it voluntarily, there are other ways to—" Mr. Bellamy. Both men stopped. The voice had come from the left. Calhoun had appeared at the fence line, sitting on his horse, watching. Silas had not heard him arrive. He did not show that it surprised him. Then, from the right, the sound of horses. Durant and 2 of the others, coming along the north fence line, stopped. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Bellamy turned his head left, then right. The hired men were doing the same. Another set of horses, from the direction of the road Pruett and the Hendersons, who had their own particular reasons for being here today. 6 men on horseback, spread in a loose half-circle around the yard, watching with the steady, unhurried attention of men who had all the time in the world. Bellamy turned back to Silas. "You've made a little show," he said. His voice was controlled, but something in it had changed a frequency, a register, something that a man like Silas, who had spent years listening to weather and animals and the particular sounds that preceded trouble, could detect the way you detected a change in wind direction. He was still performing confidence, but the performance had developed a seam. "This doesn't change the legal situation." "You're right," Silas said. "It doesn't. The legal situation gets decided in a courtroom, with documents and testimony, and whatever the territorial marshal determines is worth prosecuting. He took a step forward, not aggressive, just closing the distance enough that Bellamy had to look at him directly rather than across a comfortable gap. What this changes is what these men have seen today. You riding onto my property and telling a woman to surrender her daughter. That's what they came to witness. That's what they'll testify to if it comes to that. There's nothing here to testify. You've been threatening her for 8 months. Silas's voice was even. He was aware that his hands were very still and that this was a conscious thing. The way you kept your hands spooked animal because stillness communicated what volume couldn't. You had her wagon attacked in the mountains. A man died. She almost died. Maisie and he stopped himself because saying the child's name to this man felt like giving something away that he wanted to keep. He started again. The girl is 6 years old. She has nightmares. She watches windows. That's what your legal business has done to a 6-year-old child. Bellamy said nothing. The marshal's office has the documents, Silas said. They have the originals. They have my summary of what's in them and what I think it means. They have Lenora's account of what you said to her and what you threatened. And now they'll have whatever these men choose to report about this conversation. He paused. You came out here to frighten a woman into giving up. I'd suggest you go back the way you came and talk to your attorneys, because that's the only conversation you're going to have that matters now. The yard was completely quiet. One of the horses stamped once. A bird moved in the pines at the edge of the property. Bellamy sat absolutely still, and Silas could see him running calculations behind his eyes. The same way some man calculated a bet when he had finally looked at his cards and the table and the other players, the équerre, and understood that the hand had gone wrong somewhere. You have no idea, Bellamy said quietly, what I'm capable of. I expect I have some idea, Silas said. A man who has his wagon attacked and a driver killed and a child left in the mountains in a storm, I have some idea. Something crossed Bellamy's face then, fast, controlled, gone. But it had been there, and Silas had seen it. And it was not the reaction of a man who was being falsely accused. That was not he started. Save it for the marshal, Silas said. Bellamy looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the men along the fence line, one side and then the other. Durant met his gaze without any particular expression, which was somehow worse than hostility, just an older man watching a situation with the patience of someone who had already made his assessment. Bellamy gathered his reins. This isn't over, he said. I know, Silas said. I'll be here. Bellamy turned his horse. The 2 hired men fell in behind him, and they rode back the way they'd come, out to the road and east, without looking back. Silas watched them go. He kept watching until the road was empty and the sound of hooves had faded below the threshold of hearing. Then he exhaled. Calhoun rode over.
Well, he said.
That was something. Yeah, Silas said. He'll be back. Or he'll send someone. I know. The Henderson boy said he recognized one of the hired men. Thinks he's connected to the wagon attack. The driver that died, Henderson, knew him. Silas looked at him. Can he testify to that? He says he can. Silas stood with that for a moment in the yard with the cold morning air on his face and the sound of the horses settling back into their normal rhythms around the fence line. Another piece. The pattern was becoming more solid, more visible, more difficult to dismiss as one woman's account against a powerful man's reputation. I need to write another letter to Billings, he said. I'll carry it if you want. I'm passing through town tomorrow. I'd appreciate that. The neighbors began to disperse, by ones and twos, with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done what they came to do and had their own properties to get back to. A few words exchanged, a few nods. Durant paused before he left and said to Silas, without particular emphasis, the Birch woman. She's still in Laramie. Her sister's address. If the marshal needs another statement. He handed over a folded piece of paper and wrote out before Silas could respond. Silas stood in the yard holding it. He went inside. Lenora was in the kitchen. Not in the back room, she was standing at the kitchen window, which told him she'd seen at least part of what had happened, and her expression confirmed it. Maisie was at her side, still holding both the doll and the wooden horse, watching Silas with a look that was trying very hard not to be afraid. He's gone? Lenora asked. For now, she nodded slowly. What did he say? What you'd expect? Legal threats, implications. Tried to tell me I didn't understand the situation. And the men, they were here. He put Durant's piece of paper on the table. The Henderson boy recognized one of the hired men. He can place him at the wagon attack. He watched her face process this, the brief, involuntary tightening around her eyes that happened when something long feared was finally named. If that holds up, Bellamy isn't just looking at a fraudulent debt case, looking at something considerably worse. Lenora put her hand on the back of the kitchen chair, not to sit down, just to have something to hold on to. He knows that now. He knows what you sent to Billings. Yes, he'll move faster, try to get ahead of it, probably. Which is why I need to write to Billings tonight and tell them about this morning. Everything what he said, what the Henderson boy knows, Durant's information about the Birch woman. He paused. We're building something, Lenora. It doesn't feel like it yet because we're still in the middle of it. But it's building. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see its windows were dark, and he could see the competing things in her expression, the hope she didn't want to act on prematurely, the fear that had been her companion for 8 months and didn't know how to stand down, and underneath both of those, something that had been slowly, steadily growing since the first morning when she'd opened her eyes in the spare room and found him sitting in the chair beside the bed. He said it wasn't over, she said. He did. Do you believe him? Yes, Silas said. But I also believe it ends. These things end one way or another. He's made enough mistakes. We just have to make fewer than he does for long enough. She looked at the table, at Durant's folded paper, at the view outside the window where the road ran straight and empty to the east. Then she straightened. The hand came off the chair back. She looked like herself again, the particular version of herself that Silas had come to recognize as her baseline. The one that had survived everything so far, and intended to keep doing it. I'll make dinner while you write the letter, she said. Maisie, who had been listening to all of this with her measuring, careful attention, looked up at Silas. He didn't take me, she said. Statement of fact, not question. No, Silas said. He didn't. She looked at the wooden horse in her hand. Then she set it very deliberately on the kitchen table, not tucked away, not clutched against her, just set it down in the open, where it could be seen. It was a small thing. He wasn't entirely sure what it meant to her, but he understood, watching her do it, that it meant something. He sat down at the table and pulled out paper and pen. Outside, the road was empty, and the mountains were still, and the afternoon was turning its slow angle toward evening, and somewhere east of them Rourke Bellamy was riding back toward whatever calculations he was making, toward whatever move came next. The threat was not gone. The situation was not resolved. The letter in Billings had been acknowledged but not acted on. The evidence was real but still scattered. The case was building but not built. But in this kitchen, in the ordinary smell of dinner starting on the stove and the sound of Maisie quietly repositioning her doll on the chair beside her, something had shifted. Not in the external situation that was still dangerous, still uncertain, still requiring everything they had, but in the 3 people sitting and standing in this room. Something had moved, had settled into a new arrangement, the way things settle after a long shaking finally stops. Silas wrote the letter in his deliberate, slightly bad handwriting, setting down everything he'd witnessed and everything he'd been told, building the case line by line, the way he built everything without rushing, without assuming it would come out right on its own, just putting in the work and trusting that enough of it, done carefully enough, would add up to something that held. He was halfway through the second page when Maisie, without looking up from her doll, said, Mr. Silas, is this our home now? He kept writing. He let the question sit in the room for a moment, the way questions deserved to sit sometimes before they got answered. What do you think? He said. She appeared to think about it seriously. It smells like cedar, she said, like something that stays. He finished the sentence he was writing. He didn't stop or look up, because making too much of it would have been the wrong thing. But he thought, yes, that's exactly what it is. The second letter from Billings arrived 11 days after Silas sent his account of Bellamy's visit. This one was not from the deputy. This one was from Haskell himself. Silas read it at the kitchen table with Lenora sitting across from him, which was where she'd insisted on being when he came in from collecting the mail and she'd seen his expression. He didn't have a poker face, had never needed one. He lived alone, and animals didn't care what your face was doing, and whatever had crossed his features when he unfolded the letter in the yard had been enough for her to put down what she was doing and come to the table and say quietly, read it out loud. He did. Haskell wrote in a different register than his deputy still official, still measured, but with more between the lines. The language of a man who had been working a problem for a long time and had just received a piece that changed the shape of it. He confirmed that the documents Silas had forwarded, combined with the additional information about Henderson witness and the Birch woman's situation, had elevated the matter from a civil dispute to a criminal investigation. He wrote that 2 other cases in adjacent territories had been linked to Bellamy's operation through property records that matched the pattern in Lenora's documents. He wrote that he would be traveling to Hollow Creek within the next 2 weeks and would need to take formal statements from Lenora Whitlock and any witnesses Silas could make available. He wrote one other thing near the end, in a single sentence that Silas read and then read again. The man identified by the Henderson boy as present at the wagon attack had been located and was currently in custody in another jurisdiction on a separate charge, and had expressed willingness to provide information about his employer in exchange for consideration of his situation. Silas stopped reading. Lenora was looking at him. "He's talking," she said. It wasn't a question. She had followed the same sentence he had. "Sounds like it." She put both hands flat on the table. She looked at them. He could see her working through what this meant, not the legal technicalities, which neither of them fully understood, but the human reality of it. One of Bellamy's hired men, the one who had been at the wagon, was telling the marshal's office what he knew, which meant Bellamy's careful construction, the layers of legal language, the judges in his pocket he built to insulate himself from the consequences of what he did, had developed a crack from the inside. "He'll find out," she said. "If that man is talking, Bellamy will find out. He has people everywhere." "He probably already knows," Silas said. She looked up at him. "Which means he's deciding right now what to do about it," Silas said. "Whether to cut his losses, whether to run, whether to come at us harder before Haskell gets here." He folded the letter and set it on the table between them. 2 weeks. We need to be careful for 2 weeks. We've been careful. More careful than that. She looked at him steadily. What does more careful look like? He'd been thinking about this since he'd read the letter in the yard, working through the variables. "Calhoun stays closer." I talked to Dran again. "Nobody goes into town alone, not you. Not Maisie, not me if I can help it." He paused. "And we tell Maisie, not the details, but enough that she knows to stay close and take it seriously." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "She already takes everything seriously." "She does. But she needs to hear it directly, not piece it together from what she overhears." Lenora nodded slowly. "Tonight," she said, "after dinner." They told Maisie that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after the plates were cleared, in the plain, direct way they'd both settled into with her no softening, no approximations, just the truth scaled to what she needed to know. There was a lawman coming to help them. The bad man knew the lawman was coming. For the next 2 weeks, they needed to be extra careful. Stay close to the house. No going to the fence line alone. No wandering toward the road. No exceptions. Maisie listened with her hands folded on the table in front of her, in an unconscious imitation of the way Lenora sat sowet when she was paying close attention. "How many days is 2 weeks?" she asked. 14, Lenora said. "Can I count them?" "Yes." "With a mark on something? Like on the wall?" Silas said not the wall. He got up and found a piece of board in the pile near the stove that he used for kindling flat, unpainted, about the size of a small plank. He brought it back to the table with a piece of... "Here." Maisie looked at the board, at the charcoal, and then at him. Most of its windows were dark. Something crossed her face that he was getting better at reading the brief, unguarded expression she wore when something was more than she'd expected. She took the charcoal, made the first mark, set it carefully at the edge of the table where she could see it. 14, she said. "Then the marshal comes and it gets better?" "That's what we're working toward," Lenora said. "And if the bad man comes before that, then Mr. Silas handles it," Silas said, "and so do the neighbors. Same as before." She considered this. Okay. Then she picked up her wooden horse and went to sit by the stove, apparently satisfied in the way she always seemed to reach a point of satisfaction with information, and then simply move on, without circling back, without requiring reassurance. He had decided this was either remarkable self-possession for a 6-year-old or a child who had learned that circling back didn't change anything, and it was probably some of both. The days that followed had a particular quality that Silas couldn't quite name. Not peaceful, there was too much under the surface for that. The constant awareness of what was coming and what might come first, but not frantic either. They moved through each day with a kind of deliberate steadiness, like people maintaining their footing on uncertain ground by moving carefully rather than stopping. Lenora prepared for Haskell's visit with the same focused thoroughness she'd brought to everything. She organized the documents into a sequence she could present clearly, made notes in the margins of her own copies, wrote out a timeline of events going back to the first loan from Bellamy, cross-referenced by date and document. She did this at the kitchen table in the evenings after Maisie was in bed, sometimes until late. Silas sat across from her more often than not, going through his own notes, and the comfortable workings were dark, and the comfortable working quiet that had developed between them in the past weeks was something he had stopped noticing as unusual and started simply accepting as how evenings were now. He caught himself once, sitting back from his papers and watching her work without saying anything. The waist of its windows were dark. The way she moved through the documents was methodical and unsentimental. She didn't flinch at the ones that had caused her the most damage, didn't handle them with more care than they required. Plus, they were evidence. She used them accordingly. There was something in that specific quality, the ability to look at the record of your own worst time without looking away, that he found quietly extraordinary and had no intention of saying out loud. She looked up and caught him looking. He went back to his papers. She went back to hers. Neither of them said anything, but he was aware, without looking, that she was trying not to smile. On the 5th day, Calhoun came by with news from town. There was a rumor circulating in Hollow Creek, not quite a rumor, more the specific kind of information that moved through a small community and was accurate enough in its broad shape even when the details were wrong, that Bellamy had recently discharged both of his remaining hired men and had been seen leaving the hotel in Millard, the larger town 40 miles east, in the early morning with luggage. Nobody knew where he'd gone. Silas received this information standing in the yard, turned it over, and did not allow himself to feel relieved by it. Running, Calhoun offered. Maybe, Silas said, or repositioning. Pulling back visible connections before the marshal arrives, getting himself somewhere he can claim he has no involvement in whatever happens next. Does that help you or hurt you? Both. If he's gone, the immediate physical danger is lower. If he's lawyered himself up somewhere and is working to discredit the documents and the witnesses before Haskell gets here, that's a different problem. Calhoun thought about this with the measured patience of a man who did not waste energy on problems until their shape was clear. The Henderson boy still says what he says. Yes. And the man in custody is still talking. Far as you know. Far as I know. Then maybe Bellamy running is the best thing that could have happened. Maybe. Silas was not ready to accept it yet. He'd dealt with enough difficult situations to know that the moment you believed the worst was over was often the moment something came at you from a direction you hadn't been watching. He told Lenora when he went inside. She received the news the same way he had, without relief, with recalibration. He has lawyers in 3 territories, she said. Wherever he goes, he's not idle. No. Then we keep working. She turned back to her papers. He looked at her for a moment. Are you ever just frightened? Not thinking about the next step, not making notes. Just frightened. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, in the middle of the night sometimes, when it's quiet and I can't outthink it. She didn't look up from the papers. I used to get up and check on Maisie, just to hear her breathing. That helped. Does it still? Now I get up and I can hear both of you. She turned a page. That helps more. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything then. There wasn't to say that either too much or not enough. So he said nothing, which was the right choice, and after a moment they both went back to work. The 9th day brought something unexpected. A woman arrived at the ranch in the late morning, driving her own wagon, alone. She was perhaps 60, with the sun-weathered look of someone who had spent decades outdoors, and the upright posture of a woman who had not let those decades diminish her. She pulled up in the yard and looked at Silas, who had come out when he heard the wagon, with the direct assessing look of someone who had decided to do something difficult and was going to do it without preamble. You're Mercer, she said. I am. My name is Ida Birch. Connie Durant sent word to my sister in Laramie's. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, with the economical movements of someone who hadn't waited for help in a long time. I heard there's a woman here named Lenora Whitlock who's got documents on Bellamy. Silas looked at her. You came from Laramie? Left 4 days ago. She said it without emphasis, as though a 4-day solo journey was unremarkable. If there's a marshal coming and they're building a case, I want to be part of it. I lost my property to that man. My husband built that land for 30 years. I want it on record what he did. Silas stepped back from the door. Come inside. The meeting between Ida Birch and Lenora Whitlock was not an emotional one, at least not on the surface. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table and talked for almost 3 hours. And what happened was less like two people sharing a painful experience and more like two engineers comparing notes on the same structural failure precise, detailed focused on facts and dates and specific language, and the particular mechanisms by which Bellamy had worked. Ida was older and sharper and had lost more. Lenora was more systematic and had better documentation. Together, the pattern they assembled was considerably more complete than either had possessed alone. Silas sat at the edge of the room and listened. Maisie sat next to him, which she had taken to doing in recent days. When things happened that she was trying to understand, positioning herself adjacent to the adult she'd decided was most likely to make sense of what was happening. At some point, she leaned against his arm, not fully, just slightly, in the way a child does when they've stopped calculating the gesture, and it simply happened. He didn't move. He continued listening to Ida and Lenora dismantle Rourke Bellamy piece by piece across his kitchen table. Ida stayed 3 days. She slept on the cot that had been Maisie's in the first nights, and Maisie moved in with Lenora, and the ranch accommodated this rearrangement without difficulty in the way that a place with enough space and practical people manages rearrangements. Ida was not warm in the way that invited sentiment, but she was fair and she was direct and she was, it turned out, quietly good with Maisie not performing goodness, just treating the child like a person with sense, which Maisie responded to the way she always responded to being treated like a person with sense. On the second evening, Ida looked at Maisie's board with the 14 marks and said, "What's that counting?" "Days until the marshal comes," Maisie said. "How many left?" 6. Maisie had been marking each morning with the focused ceremony of someone performing a ritual that mattered. Then it gets better. Ida looked at the board for a moment. Then she said to Silas, without particular sentiment, "Smart kid." "Yeah," he said. "She is." On Ida's third morning, Silas rode into Hollow Creek to post another letter to Billings and came back with news that changed the shape of everything. He found Lenora and Ida at the table, still at the documents, and he stood in the doorway long enough that both women looked up. "There's a judge coming with Haskell," he said. "Not a local one. From the territorial capital." Ida set down her pen. Lenora was very still. "A judge from the capital doesn't make a 3-day ride to interview witnesses in a civil debt case," Ida said. "No," Silas said, "he doesn't. How did you hear this?" "Pickett. He carries more than mail." He came to the table and sat down. "Apparently the word came through official channels this morning. Haskell and a territorial judge arriving in 4 days. Not 2 weeks, 4 days. Lenora absorbed this. They're moving faster. The man in custody. Whatever he's told them, it's moved things along considerably. Or Bellamy's lawyers filed something, and Haskell is trying to get ahead of it," Ida said. "Either way," Silas said, 4 days. Maisie appeared from the back room with her charcoal. She went to the board without a word and crossed out several marks and wrote a new number at the top. Then she looked at the adults. 4, she said. "That's better than 6. Despite everything, Silas almost laughed. He got close enough that Lenora noticed, and her mouth did the thing it did when she was suppressing something, a particular compression at the corner that he'd learned to read over the past weeks, as the near smile she deployed when amusement was inconvenient. The next 4 days were the longest and the strangest. Ida worked with Lenora on their combined testimony, refining the account, making sure every claim was matched to a specific document. Silas spent time with each of the neighboring men, updating them on the developments, making sure they understood that an official proceeding was coming and that their account of Bellamy's visit to the ranch might be requested formally. Durant, who had apparently been expecting something like this, had already written out his recollection of the confrontation in the yard and had it notarized in Hollow Creek, which surprised everyone except Calhoun, who said that Durant had been a staff sergeant for 15 years, and you did not surprise him into being unprepared. On the third day, a man arrived at the ranch who Silas didn't know. He came alone on a good horse, with the careful bearing of a man who was used to being received with some formality and was adjusting his expectations downward for a working ranch without apparent difficulty. He was perhaps 45, clean-shaven, with the kind of eyes that took in a room quickly and retained everything. "My name is Ellis Karn," he said to Silas in the yard. "I'm an attorney. I represent several parties who have interests in the investigation of Rourke Bellamy's land brokerage operations." He paused. "I'm not Bellamy's attorney. I want to be clear about that immediately." Silas looked at him. "Whose parties?" "The families who lost property. 6 of them across 3 territories, whose cases were identified through the same documentation pattern that appears in Mrs. Whitlock's papers." He reached into his coat and produced a letter. "Marshal Haskell asked me to make contact ahead of his arrival. He wanted Mrs. Whitlock to have legal representation present when she gives her statement." Silas took the letter, checked the seal official, matching the header on Haskell's previous correspondence. He let Karn inside. Lenora's meeting with Karn was the most important conversation that had happened in the Mercer kitchen, and it lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, Lenora came out of the back room where they'd spoken privately and sat down at the kitchen table with the look of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down. Not that they have set it down yet, but that the setting down is possible. "He says the case is significant," she said. "Not just my documents. All of it together, 6 families, the property records, the forged signatures, the man in custody." She put her hands on the table. "He says Bellamy has been charged in another territory. He was picked up 2 days ago in Cheyenne. He's in custody." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Ida Birch, who had been sitting at the edge of the room, set down her coffee cup with a small, precise click. "In custody," she said. "Yes." Ida looked at the table for a moment. Most of its windows were dark. When she looked up, her expression was composed, but there was something moving behind it that was private and not for anyone else to examine too closely. She stood up, straightened her coat, picked up her cup, and went to the stove to refill it, and did not say anything else for several minutes. Maisie, who had come in from the yard at some point and was standing in the doorway in her coat with mud on her boots, looked between the adults. "Did something good happen?" she asked. "Something very good," Lenora said. Maisie looked at her board with its marks. Then she picked up the charcoal and crossed out all the remaining marks and made a single new mark at the top, big and deliberate. "Done," she said. Lenora pressed her hand over her mouth for a second. Just 1 second. Then she took her hand down and said, "Go wash your boots before you come any further inside." Maisie went to wash her boots. The adults sat with what had just happened. It was Karn who brought them back to the practical, which was probably his function in most situations. He told them that Bellamy being in custody in Cheyenne did not end the matter. There were legal proceedings to come, testimony to be given, the civil cases of the 6 families to be addressed separately from the criminal case. Lenora's statement to Haskell would still be necessary and still mattered. The documents were still essential. None of the work they'd done was wasted. It was, in fact, the core of what had made the case movable. "The forged signatures," he said to Lenora. "Those documents and your originals with your genuine signature, that comparison is what broke the larger case open. Because once they had your example, they found the same forger's work in documents belonging to 2 other families. One man doing the forgeries for Bellamy's operations across all 3 territories. When they found him, he had copies of everything." Lenora listened to this with her hands flat on the table. "I want you to understand," Karn said, "that this case was broken by the evidence you preserved and the risk you took in bringing it to someone who could use it. I have dealt with Bellamy's type before, and the reason men like him operate for as long as they do is that most people in your situation either can't document what's been done to them or are too frightened to try, and most you did both." She nodded. Not in the self-satisfied way, more in the way of someone receiving information that is accurate and doesn't require embellishment. "What about the guardianship claim?" she said. "The clause. Void. Void from the beginning. Almost certainly the debt it was attached to was fraudulent, and there are significant questions about whether the document as revised was ever legally binding to begin with. Your attorney, meaning me, if you'll have me, will file to have it formally declared unenforceable as part of the proceeding. That's not complicated. For the first time in the conversation, Lenora closed her eyes. Just briefly, just the space of a breath. Silas, who had been sitting to the side, watching her and watching Karn with the steady attention he brought to any situation he wasn't certain about, decided in that moment that Karn was what he appeared to be. He based this on nothing more scientific than 20 years of reading people in situations that required accurate readings, which was not a guarantee, but was better than nothing. "What do you need from us before Haskell arrives?" Silas asked. Karn looked at him. "Exactly what you have. The organized documentation, the witnesses who can attest to the confrontation in the yard, Mrs. Whitlock's timeline." He paused. "And whatever you personally know about the condition in which you found Mrs. Whitlock and her daughter after the wagon attack. Your account of the scene, the injuries, the evidence of how long they'd been there. That establishes the physical reality of what happened in those mountains in a way that documents alone can't." Silas thought about the overturned wagon, the scattered supplies, the single shoe in the mud, Maisie against the pine trunk with her too big coat and her doll and her old eyes. "I can tell it," he said. "I know you can." Karn said it simply, without flattery, which made Silas trust it more. "Question is whether you can tell it as clearly and specifically as possible when you're sitting in front of a territorial judge who is going to be looking for precision. Can you do that?" "I can." "Good." That evening, after Karn had taken the small bedroom they'd cleared for him, and Ida had gone to her cot, and Maisie was asleep, Silas and Lenora sat at the kitchen table in the quiet way they'd sat many evenings now. The documents were put away. There was nothing that needed doing in the immediate hour. It was the first time in 2 weeks that the space around them hadn't been occupied by something urgent, and the absence of urgency had a texture to it, not quite ease, not yet, but the first edge of it. Lenora had her coffee, which was actually warm for once. She was looking at the table, not at him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what happens after." He waited. "When this is over, when the legal matters are resolved, and Maisie's guardianship is formally settled, and the Bellamy situation is finished." She turned her cup in her hands. "I've been running for so long that I'm not sure I know what I do when I stop." "I think you already know," he said. She looked at him. "You've been doing it," he said, "for the past 3 weeks. The accounts, the neighbors' contracts. The way you went through Karn today, you were checking his credentials in your head before he got to the second sentence." She was quiet. "You know what you're good at," he said. "You've known the whole time. You just haven't had the ground to stand on while you did it." She looked at him in the particular way she had, that he'd come to think of as her most honest look without the careful play of assessment, just the thing itself. "Is this still what you want?" she said. "Because it has not been simple. What you signed on for in those letters was considerably less complicated than what actually arrived." He thought about the envelope on the platform, the empty train, the horse that had stopped in the pines, the small cold hand in his. "What I signed on for," he said, "was building something. I said that in the letter. It's harder than I expected, and it's not done, and it doesn't look the way I thought it would when I wrote it." He paused. "But I'm not in the habit of stopping work on a thing because it turned out to be more complicated than I thought." She held his gaze for a long moment. "You're a stubborn man," she said. "I've been told. I mean it kindly." "I know." Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the edge of the property, and the horses shifted in the corral, and Maisie made the small sound she sometimes made in her sleep when something was processing behind her eyes, which Lenora had told him was normal and happened whenever the day had been particularly full. The day had been particularly full. Lenora set her cup down and stood up and said she was going to check on Maisie, the way she did every night before bed, the routine of it as established now as anything on the ranch. He watched her go down the hall. He sat for a moment in the quiet. Thought about 14 marks on a board, counted down to nothing. He thought about a woman who had preserved 2 years of evidence in a small trunk and carried it through a mountain crash because she understood that it was the only real weapon she had. He thought about Ida Birch, who had driven 4 days from Laramie alone and walked into a stranger's house because she wanted what had been taken from her to be on record. He thought about Durant's notarized statement. and Calhoun's steady presence, and the Henderson boy who had recognized a face in a yard. He thought about Bellamy in custody in Cheyenne, and the particular kind of satisfaction was not triumph, nothing as clean as triumph, but was something more durable. The satisfaction of something built correctly, piece by piece, until it held. Lenora came back from the hallway. "She's fine," she said, "sleeping hard." "Good." She paused at the edge of the kitchen, one hand on the doorframe. She looked at him with an expression he didn't have a category for, yet he was still learning her expressions, would probably be learning them for a long time, which was not a thought that troubled him. "Silas." She said, "Yeah, thank you." She said it plainly without ceremony. Not for finding us, for everything after. He thought about several things he could say and discarded all of them. "Go to sleep, Lenora." She almost smiled. The full version, this time not quite suppressed. "Good night," she said. She went to bed. He stayed at the table another few minutes the way he always did, the old habit of a man who had spent years making sure everything was in order before he let himself rest. He checked the door, checked the stove, added a log, because the temperature would drop before morning. The board with Maisie's marks was on the kitchen counter. He looked at it, all the marks crossed out, the single final mark she'd made in charcoal, big and deliberate. Done. He turned down the lamp and went to bed. In Cheyenne, Rourke Bellamy sat in a cell and considered his options, which were considerably fewer than they had been a month ago. In Laramie, the family of a deceased wagon driver waited for someone to tell them that what had happened to their father and husband had been seen and named and would be answered for. In 3 territories, 6 families held documents they'd been told might mean they could reclaim what they'd lost. In Hollow Creek, the community that had whispered about the mysterious woman at Mercer Ranch was quietly revising its understanding of who she was and what she'd done. And in a room at the back of a Montana ranch house, a 6-year-old girl slept with a rag doll under her chin and a wooden horse on the table beside her, in a place that smelled like cedar, in a home that had been built from necessity and letters, and the refusal of 2 imperfect people to let the worst possible outcome be the only possible outcome. 4 days, Haskell was coming, the judge was coming. Testimony would be given, and the documents would be entered, and the legal machinery would begin its slow, imprecise work. It would not be clean. It would not be fast. There would be things that went wrong, and things that fell short, and things that never resolved the way they should have. But the foundation had been laid, and Silas Mercer understood foundations. Marshall Haskell arrived on a Thursday, which was not the day anyone had expected him. He'd sent no advance the change, just the yard at Mercer Ranch in the mid-morning with a territorial judge named Alderman and a clerk who said nothing and wrote everything down. With the focused efficiency of a man paid by the word. Haskell was not what Silas had built in his mind from the correspondence. He'd expected someone larger, more formal, more obviously official. The man who dismounted in the yard was compact and wind-weathered, and somewhere past 50, with a gray mustache and the deliberate movements of someone who had been doing a difficult job for a long time and had stopped performing the difficulty of it. He introduced himself to Silas with a handshake, not a speech, and looked around the yard with the quick, comprehensive assessment of a man cataloging details for later use. Judge Alderman was different, taller, formal in his bearing, with the courtroom quality of a man accustomed to having rooms arrange themselves around his authority. He nodded to Silas without warmth, which Silas took as professional rather than personal. This was not a social call, and Alderman saw no reason to pretend it was. Karn came out from the house and met them in the yard, and there was a brief exchange among the 3 official men that had the quality of a conversation, continuing from an earlier point, references in shorthand that told Silas this group had worked together before and trusted each other within the limits of their respective roles. He watched the exchange without trying to join it and drew his conclusions. He went inside to tell Lenora. She was already at the table with the documents in front of her, which meant she'd heard the horses in the yard and had made her own conclusions. She looked up when he came in. She was pale in the specific way she got pale when something big was happening, and she was working very hard to meet it steadily. "They're here," he said, "I heard." She looked at the documents. "All right, you've been through this material 100 times. I know. Karn is good. He knows what he's doing. I know that too." She looked up at him. "I'm not worried about the material or the attorney. I'm worried about sitting in front of a judge and saying out loud, in formal testimony, every single thing Bellamy did, with someone writing it down. She paused. I've been saying it in my head for 2 years. I've never said it in front of someone with authority to act on it. What if she stopped? What? He said. What if I fall apart? She said it quietly, not dramatically. Just a fear named plainly. Silas sat down across from her. He thought about what she actually needed to hear, which was not reassurance for its own sake. You won't, he said. Not because you're strong you are, but that's not the reason. Because you're angry. You've been angry for 2 years, and you've had nowhere to put it. Today you have somewhere to put it. She held his gaze. And if you do fall apart, he said, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, Karn stops the proceeding, and you take the time you need, and then you keep going. That's allowed. She looked at him for another moment. Then she stood up and straightened her papers and said, send them in. The formal proceedings at Mercer Ranch occupied most of the day. Haskell had set up in the main room, which was not designed for this purpose, but had been reorganized by Karn the previous evening into something functional table moved, chairs placed, enough space for the principals and the clerk. Silas remained outside for the first hours, in the yard and the barn and the near field, doing the work that needed, doing regardless of what was happening inside, cut Beanstalk, because the animals did not understand legal proceedings and needed feeding on the same schedule they always did. Maisie stayed close to him. Ida Birch was inside her own testimony would come later in the afternoon, and she had been waiting for it with the contained, purposeful energy of a woman who had traveled 4 days for this exact hour. Maisie sat on the fence near the corral and watched Silas work, and didn't say much, which was normal, but there was a quality to her quiet that was different from her usual comfortable silence. More watchful, more aware of the house behind her. She's going to be fine, Silas said, without looking up from what he was doing. Maisie considered this. How do you know? Because I know her. You've only known her for a few weeks. Sometimes a few weeks tells you everything you need. She was quiet for a moment. Is that true? Really? Stopped what he was doing and looked at her. You knew the first night whether I was safe to trust, didn't you? She looked at her boots. I wasn't sure at first. But by morning, a pause. By morning I thought you were probably okay. She looked up. The bread helped. You left bread out where I could find it. You didn't make me ask. He hadn't thought about that. He'd just put the bread out because she was a child and children needed to eat, and he hadn't known what else to do at 2 in the morning with a scared 6-year-old in his kitchen. He hadn't calculated it as a gesture. Sometimes the thing that matters isn't the big thing, he said. It's the small thing done right. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to everything. Like the wooden horse. Yeah, like that. She nodded slowly and went back to watching the house. Karn came out twice during the morning once to ask Silas a clarifying question about the date he'd found the wagon, cross-referencing against a document that had been submitted as evidence, and once simply to get water and to say, without being asked, that Lenora was doing well. He said it precisely and without elaboration, which was how Silas knew it was true and not just comfort. When it was Silas's turn to testify, he was called inside around midday. He washed his hands at the pump, which was a habit rather than a preparation, and went in. He had expected to be uncomfortable. He was, slightly, in the particular way of a man who expressed himself better through action than language, and was now being asked to perform language in front of strangers with official functions. But Haskell questioned him with the direct, practical efficiency of someone who wanted facts in a specific order and didn't need them decorated, which suited Silas well. He described finding the wagon. He described the scene, the wheel still turning, the supplies scattered, the single shoe in the mud. He described Maisie against the tree. He described Lenora's condition, her temperature, the wound at her temple, how long he estimated she had been there based on the state of the supplies and the cold of her skin. He described carrying them down the mountain. He was accurate, and he was specific, and he did not embellish, because the reality of it didn't require embellishment. At one point, the clerk stopped writing briefly and looked up at him, and then looked back down at his paper, which Silas thought was probably not a thing the man did often. Judge Alderman, who had been listening with an expression that revealed nothing, asked 2 questions at the end. The first was whether, in Silas's assessment of the scene, the wagon's condition was consistent with an accident or with something more deliberate. Silas said he was not an investigator, but that he had looked at the damage to the wagon frame and the way the wheel had come off, and he would say it was worth a more expert examination, because the damage pattern had not looked entirely like a simple road accident to him, though he acknowledged he could be wrong about that. The second question was simpler. Alderman asked what Silas's relationship to Lenora Whitlock was at the time he conducted his search. Silas said she was the woman who was supposed to arrive on the train and hadn't. Alderman looked at him. You rode into the mountains in a storm for a woman you had never met. I wrote her letters for 6 months, Silas said. She wrote me back. I knew her. Alderman's expression didn't change, but something in it, some quality of formal distance, shifted very slightly. He made a note. He moved on. Ida Birch testified in the afternoon. Silas did not hear it. He was outside again with Maisie, doing the afternoon chores. But when Ida came out 2 hours later, she had the expression of someone who had set down a weight they'd been carrying a long time. Not relief, exactly. Something more final. She stood in the yard and looked at the mountains for a moment, and Silas left her to it. The formal session concluded in the late afternoon. Haskell came out to the yard, where Silas was splitting wood for no particular reason, except that the afternoon had required something physical, and splitting wood was what presented itself. The marshal stood and watched him for a moment, then leaned against the fence post. That's solid work, what you did, he said, getting the copies to us early. The confrontation with Bellamy in front of witnesses. Having Carn here when we arrived, he paused. That wasn't luck. No, Silas said. You've dealt with difficult men before. Few. Bellamy's attorneys are already filing motions in Cheyenne. They'll make this complicated and slow. I want you to be prepared for that. Silas split another piece. How slow? Months, probably. Criminal case and the civil cases are separate proceedings. The family's recovering their property that's going to take longer than the criminal matter. Possibly a year or more. He looked at Silas directly. The threat to the child is gone. I want you to understand that clearly. Whatever Bellamy's lawyers file, the guardianship claim was fraudulent from the start, and it has been formally declared unenforceable as of this afternoon. Judge Alderman signed the order. That part is done. Silas set them all down. The child is safe, Haskell said. Legally, definitively. Whatever else takes time, that doesn't. Silas stood with that for a moment. Outside of himself, in the yard, a wind moved through the pines, and the horses made their ordinary sounds in the corral. And from inside the house came the sound of Maisie asking Lenora, something in the particular she used when she was demanding an explanation for a thing she decided deserved one. He picked them all back up. Thank you, he said. Haskell nodded and went back inside. Lenora came out an hour later, when the light was going gold and flat the way it did in late afternoon, and stood in the yard a few feet from where Silas was finishing with the wood. She didn't say anything immediately. He stacked the last of it and turned around. Her eyes were red at the edges, which was the only evidence she'd allow of what the day had cost her. She was standing straight, and her chin was level, and her hands were at her sides, which was how she stood when she was holding something together and intended to keep holding it. It's done, she said. Haskell told me. Carn says the order is signed. The guardianship claim is void. She said it like she was still learning the weight of the words. Maisie is mine. Legally, officially, no one can contest it. Good. She looked at him. Is that all you have to say? What would you like me to say? She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I don't know. Something commensurate with the situation. You fought for 2 years, he said. You kept every document. You crossed mountains with a broken shoulder and a 6-year-old. You sat in front of a territorial judge today and said it all out loud. He looked at her steadily. I don't know what's commensurate with that. I'm not sure if anything is. She looked at him for a long moment. Her jaw was tight in the way it went tight when she was not going to cry in front of anyone, which was a decision he respected and would not interfere with. Okay, she said finally. Okay, he said. She went back inside to start dinner, because dinner needed starting, and that was the kind of woman she was. Haskell and Alderman left the following morning, taking Carn and the silent clerk with them. Ida Birch stayed one more day. There were additional statements she was giving to a deputy who arrived separately, related to her own property case, and by the time that was complete, the afternoon was too far along for a safe departure. She left the next morning at dawn, with the same unceremonious efficiency she'd arrived with, except that she paused at the door and looked at Maisie, who had gotten up to see her off, despite the hour. "You're a sensible child," Ida told her. It was the highest compliment Ida Birch appeared to offer. Maisie accepted it with the gravity it deserved. "You're brave," she said, "for coming all this way." Ida looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "So are you," and went to her wagon. They watched her drive out to the road, apiece. Maisie stood in the cold morning air long after the wagon was out of sight, which Silas understood as her particular way of honoring something. He stood with her until she was ready to go back inside. The weeks that followed were the strangest weeks Silas could remember, which was saying something given what the previous month had contained. The immediate danger was gone, and the legal proceedings were underway, and there was nothing requiring crisis-level response, which left all three of them in the unfamiliar position of simply living, moving through ordinary days on a ranch without the constant background hum of threat. It took longer to adjust to than any of them would have predicted. Maisie kept checking the window for the first week, the habit so ingrained that she did it automatically before catching herself. Lenora woke at small sounds for 2 weeks more, a residual alertness that gradually, slowly, began to ease. Silas noticed the easing because he'd been watching for it. Most of its windows were dark. Not obviously he wasn't a hovering man, and she would not have welcomed hovering, but with the peripheral attention he'd always brought to things that mattered. The same attention he gave to weather and animals, and the small signs that told you what was coming before it arrived. He watched her shoulders drop a fraction, watched her stop calculating the distance to the door when someone knocked, watched her laugh at something Maisie said one evening with the unguarded, unself-conscious laughter of someone who had momentarily forgotten to be careful and then didn't reassemble the carefulness afterward, just left the laughter where it was. The ranch itself changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of a story where transformation is announced and invisible. Most of its windows were dark, but in the accumulation of small alterations that were each individually unremarkable and together amounted to something completely different from what had been there before. The pantry reorganized in a way that actually made sense. A kitchen garden staked out behind the house that would not produce anything beautiful until spring, but which Maisie had planned with the focused ambition of someone who intended to be present for the results. A new set of accounts in Lenora's handwriting, cleaner and more accurate than the ones Silas had kept for years, with notes in the margins about seasonal expenses he'd been absorbing without tracking. Thus, one afternoon he came in from the barn to find her at the table with the account books and 2 letters, one from a neighboring farm and one she'd written in response. "Ella Pruitt asked me to look at a contract before she signs it," Lenora said, without looking up. "The terms are standard in 3 places and unusual in 1. I wrote back with what I noticed and suggested she request a clarification before committing." Silas poured himself water and leaned against the counter. "When did she ask you last week?" "When I was in town for the flower," she looked up. "Problem? Why would it be?" "It's not I didn't ask you. I just did it." "Lenora," he said, "if you want to help people read contracts, you should help people read contracts. You're better at it than anyone within 40 miles. She looked at him. "I didn't train for it. I just learned because I had to. Most useful things are learned that way." She held his gaze for a moment, and he could see her weighing something, whether to say the thing she was thinking or file it away for later. She filed it. He let her. 3 days later, she took 2 more requests from neighbors. Within the month, it had become, without formal announcement, simply a thing she did, women and occasional men coming to her with agreements before signing them, not because she'd established herself as a legal expert, but because word moved in small communities in its own way. And the word on Lenora Whitlock was that she read carefully and said plainly what she found, and wasn't interested in making you feel foolish for not seeing it yourself. Maisie, meanwhile, had commandeered a corner of the barn as her domain. This had happened gradually, and Silas had permitted it, because the alternative was being the kind of man who told a 7-year-old she couldn't have a corner of the barn, which he was not. She'd made it comfortable in her own way, a crate for sitting, several items of unclear purpose arranged with obvious internal logic, a place for the wooden horse which had been joined now by 2 others he'd made over the past weeks, because once he'd started, he found it was something his hands wanted to continue. She spent time there in the afternoons with the doll and the horses and whatever project currently held her attention, and the barn had taken on the quality of all spaces inhabited regularly by children a particular vitality, a sense that important events happened there that adults were not fully privy to. She also, he noticed, stopped flinching at the sound of horses on the road. He didn't comment on this. He just noted it. The first snow came in October, earlier than usual, the kind of wet, heavy snow that bent the pine branches and made the roads uncertain for several days. The ranch contracted inward in the way ranches did in winter. Work becoming focused and close, the outside world more distant and less present. Silas had spent many winters in this contraction alone, and had made his peace with it. This winter was different in every way that mattered. They were snowed in for 3 days in early October. Not dangerously, they had supplies and wood, and the animals were housed, but thoroughly enough that going anywhere was impractical. 3 days of close quarters, and the ordinary friction of people who are always together, and the also ordinary quality of people who have chosen each other and are, in the honest moments, glad of the choosing. On the second day of being snowed in, Silas and Lenora had the first real argument of whatever they were to each other. It was about the north fence line, which he had been planning to replace in sections come spring, and which she had decided needed to happen sooner, based on her reading of the ranch accounts and her assessment of how much the current deterioration was costing them in strayed cattle. It was the kind of argument where both people were partially right, and neither was entirely wrong. And it was conducted at a volume that caused Maisie to appear in the doorway of the room where she'd been reading, survey the situation, and then silently retreat without comment. It ended the way most honest arguments end, when neither person is fighting in bad faith in the unsatisfying middle, with both of them having said what they meant, and neither fully conceding, and the actual question still technically unresolved, except that it was resolved in the sense that they both knew what the other thought about it, and would make a decision that incorporated that knowledge. Lenora made dinner. Silas did the evening animals. When he came back inside, she put food on the table and sat down and said, "You're not wrong about the timing. I understand the budget constraints. Your numbers are right," he said. "I just don't want to do the work in weather that doesn't support it. Next spring, then. First warm week." "First warm week," he agreed. Maisie appeared from her room and sat at the table and looked between them with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "Is it over?" she asked. "Yes," Lenora said. "Who won?" "Nobody," Silas said. She considered this. "That seems fair." She picked up her fork. "Mama argues like she writes. Very organized." Lenora pressed her lips together. Silas looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Eat your dinner," he said to Maisie. She ate her dinner. The snow continued outside the windows, patient and indifferent to human concerns, and the kitchen was warm and slightly imperfect, which was the only kind of warmth that actually sustained people over the long term. The letter from Karn came in November with the first update on the legal proceedings. Bellamy had pleaded through his attorneys, negotiating the criminal charges with the particular combination of legal maneuvering and strategic concession that powerful men used when they finally understood that the full case against them was more substantial than their lawyers could neutralize. He would not avoid consequence, but the consequence was being shaped by forces that moved slowly and took into account things Silas as in Lenora had no control over: other cases, other deals, the interests of the territorial courts in resolving multiple matters efficiently. He would lose his operating license and serve time. How much time was still being negotiated? The civil cases the 6 families were being addressed through a separate proceeding that Karn was handling. Karn expressed cautious optimism that property recovered through fraudulent means could be substantially restored, though the process would be long. The Birch property was among those being contested. Karn wrote that Ida had been notified and had responded with language he described as characteristically direct, which Silas took to mean she had said exactly what she thought about the pace of the proceedings and was waiting for results. Lenora read the letter twice and then set it on the table. "He's going to do less time than he deserves," she said. "Probably," Silas said. "People he hurt are going to wait a year or more to get back what's theirs. That's not justice, not really. No, he agreed. It's the law. Those aren't always the same thing. She sat with this. He could see her working through the gap between what should have been and what was, and not being satisfied with the gap, and also recognizing that not being satisfied with it was a reasonable response to reality, rather than a personal failure. The child is safe, he said. That was the thing that had to be true. That's true. She looked at him. The rest is important, he said. The other families matter, and the time he serves matters, and I'm not dismissing any of it. But you have your daughter. You're not running. That's what you came here for. She was quiet for a moment. It's not all I came here for. He looked at her. I came here for a life, she said. Not just safety. I was tired of hiding, and I wanted a life. She looked at the table, at the letter, at the familiar landscape of the kitchen that had been unfamiliar to her 3 months ago and was now simply where she lived. I think I might actually have one. He said nothing. The right response to that wasn't words. She seemed to understand this. She picked up the letter and put it with the other correspondence she kept organized in the tin box on the shelf. And she went to start coffee, and the afternoon continued in the ordinary way of afternoons that are not remarkable except in what they contain. It was December when Silas asked Lenora to marry him. He had been planning to do it in some considered way. He was a man who planned things, but what actually happened was that it was a Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every external respect. And they were both at the table after Maisie had gone to bed, and he was reading something, and she was writing something, and the lamp was burning low, and the snow was doing what snow did in December, and he looked up, and she was looking at him, and he said, I'd like you to marry me when you're ready, if you want to. She set her pen down. That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard, she said. I didn't prepare a speech, I can tell. Do you want a speech? She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her thinking, genuinely thinking, not stalling. This was one of the things he valued most about her. She didn't answer things until she'd actually considered them. No, she said. I don't want a speech. I want to know if you've actually thought about what it means. All of it. Maisie. The legal complications that are still ongoing. The fact that I have opinions about fences and account books, and I'm not going to stop having them. I've thought about all of it. And I'd still like you to marry me. She looked at him for another moment. Then yes, she said. When we're ready, when the legal matters are further along, and Maisie has had time to settle, and we've done this properly. That's not exactly a yes, he said. It's a yes with a timeline, she said, which is more honest than a yes without one. He thought about this. Fair enough. She picked up her pen. He went back to his reading. Outside, the snow continued, covering the road and the fence lines and the mountains beyond, and the lamp burned between them. And it was enough. They married in the spring. Not elaborate. There was no reason for elaborate, neither of them wanted it, and had declared that what she most cared about was that there be good food and that she be allowed to stand between them, which seemed like a reasonable set of requirements. They married beneath the cottonwoods beside the house on a Saturday morning in May, with the neighbors present and the mountains visible at the edge of the sky, and the sort of weather that arrived without earning it clear and warm, with the particular quality of spring air in Montana that made everything look recently washed. Calhoun stood on Silas's side. Ida Birch had come back from Laramie for it, which nobody had asked her to do, and which nobody commented on except Maisie, who had run to meet her wagon with the directness of a child who had decided someone mattered and acted accordingly. Durant brought his wife, who had opinions about wedding food, and implemented them, and nobody was sorry about this. It was not a perfect morning. The food got slightly cold before everyone was served. Someone sought for a cup, and the resulting stain on the tablecloth was not fully dealt with until the following day. Maisie, who had been standing solemnly between them as agreed, got distracted at the wrong moment by a bird in the cottonwood and missed part of the exchange, which she was upset about for approximately 4 minutes, and then was not. Lenora said what she promised to say with her usual directness, looking at Silas while she said it and not at the minister, because the minister was performing a function and Silas was the person the words were for. Silas said what he promised to say without a stumble, which he had privately been concerned about, and had practiced once alone in the barn where no one could hear him talking to himself. Maisie held both their hands during the last of it, one on each side with the focused gravity of someone fulfilling an important assignment. When it was over, she looked up at Silas and said, "Is it done?" "It's done," he said. "So now you're my papa?" He had expected this question eventually in some form. He had not expected it. In this moment, in front of everyone, with Lenora standing beside him, and with an earshot and the particular weight of the morning settling around all of them. He crouched down, the way he had the very first night in the pines, so he wasn't above her. "If you want me to be," he said. She considered it. Maisie considered everything. He waited. "I think I already decided," she said. "When? When you gave me the cedar horse," she said. "I decided then. I just didn't say it yet." He stayed crouched for a moment. She looked at him with those old, steady eyes that had watched him from the first night in the firelight, accounting for him, measuring him against some interior standard she had never explained and never needed to. Then she leaned forward and put her arms around his neck, which she had not done before, and held on, and Silas put his hand on her back and held on in return, and the morning went quietly on around them. He felt Lenora's hand on his shoulder, not making anything of it, just there. Months passed, when they were building something rather than merely surviving. The legal proceedings continued in the slow, frustrating way Karn had predicted, and Lenora attended to them with the same systematic patience she brought to everything, following each development and understanding each step, and occasionally telling Karn, very clearly when she thought something was being handled incorrectly, which Karn received with the equanimity of a man who had come to expect it and had noticed she was usually right. Bellamy's sentence was handed down in August. It was less than it should have been, as Lenora had predicted, and she said so once to Silas and then did not say it again. The civil cases moved slower. The Birch property resolution came through in October, and Ida wrote a letter that Lenora read aloud at the dinner table, which was brief and characteristic. The property was restored. She was returning. The law was slow, but had eventually done what it was supposed to do, and she appreciated the part that Lenora's documents had played in making it possible. She closed by saying she had heard the baby was due in spring, and she expected to be informed immediately. Lenora set the letter down and said, "How does she know about the baby?" "I only told 3 people. 4, Maisie said, without looking up from what she was doing. Lenora looked at her. "I might have mentioned it to Mrs. Calhoun," Maisie said, with the particular tone of someone who had technically answered the question and would prefer not to elaborate. The garden Maisie had planted in October of the previous year had produced that summer with the aggressive success of well-tended soil that has been waiting to be used. She'd managed most of it herself, with minimal supervision and considerable opinions about how it should be done. Silas had helped when asked and stayed out of it when not asked, which she had made clear was the appropriate division of responsibility. By August, she'd been supplying the Calhoun household with tomatoes on a semi-formal basis and conducting negotiations about the exchange rate that Calhoun had described to Silas, with visible admiration, as sharper than most men I've dealt with. She had also been going to school in Hollow Creek since September, riding in with Silas 3 days a week on the route that took them past the Calhoun place. The school was adequate. In the way of frontier schools, better than nothing, worse than it should have been, runs by a teacher named Miss Fielding, who was young and earnest and slightly overwhelmed by the range of ages in her one-room building. Maisie had decided within 2 weeks that she was going to help run it, which was not a role that had been offered to her, but she had inserted herself into it anyway by the simple expedient of being more organized than anyone else present, and Miss Fielding had, after initial resistance, accepted the assistance. On the ride home one afternoon in late October, Maisie sat in front of Silas on the horse in the way she did now, without ceremony, as though it had always been how they traveled, and she said, "Miss Fielding says I could teach someday." "What do you think about that?" Silas asked. "I think I'd be good at it," said with no false modesty and no bravado. "Just an assessment." "You probably would." "I want to teach people how to read contracts," she said, "and legal papers, so nobody can trick them." He thought about a 6-year-old in a too-big coat in the mountains, watching windows, hiding behind doors. He thought about a 14-mark board counted down to nothing. "That's a good thing to want to teach," he said. She seemed satisfied with that. They rode the rest of the way, in the comfortable quiet that had always been between them, the particular quiet of two people who had learned each other's silences and didn't feel the need to fill them. The year turned. In November, they rode into Hollow Creek for the first time. As a family on a formal occasion, the Territorial Land Registry needed Lenora's signature on a document related to the ongoing civil proceedings, and Silas needed supplies, and Maisie needed new boots, and they had simply gone together, the three of them, in the wagon, because that was how they went places now. The town received them differently than it had received Silas alone for all the years before. Not dramatically, not with any acknowledgement of the change. People in Hollow Creek were not given to dramatic acknowledgement of anything but differently. Maggie Holt at the post office counter asked Lenora about the Bellamy proceedings with the specific, invested interest of someone who had been following the matter and considered herself entitled to updates. Old Garrett Wills, who had commented on Silas's odds at the feed store a year ago, simply nodded to both of them in the street and said, "Good morning," and walked on, which from Garrett Wills was essentially an apology. Mrs. Calhoun's stopped them on the main street to ask about the baby and to give Maisie something she'd made, which Maisie accepted with the solemn courtesy she extended to gifts from people she had decided deserved it. They stopped at the station on the way back, for no particular reason Silas could have articulated. The afternoon train had come and gone, and the platform was empty, and they stood there for a moment, Lenora beside him, Maisie holding his hand on the left side. He looked at the empty platform, the place where he had stood a year ago, holding his hat in both hands, turning it twice, watching 23 people step off a train and none of them being the right one. He thought about what he'd felt in that moment, the specific quality of it, the thing he hadn't had a name for. He had one now, lost before it had actually happened, which was perhaps the worst kind, the kind that came from wanting something enough to be afraid of losing it before you'd even had it. "You're quiet," Lenora said. "I was here before," he said. "Last year. Waiting." She looked at the platform. "I know. Thought about that a lot. After. Thinking about you standing here and not knowing what had happened. I was all right, I know you were. But I thought about it anyway." She looked at the mountains, visible beyond the edge of town, heavy and gray-blue against the sky. "I was so afraid the whole way here, before the accident. I kept thinking I'd arrive and you'd see me properly, not the letters, not the careful version, but actually me, and you'd realize you'd made a mistake." "I didn't realize that," he said. "I know." She smiled, not the almost smile, the real one, the one that still felt like something given rather than performed. "I was still afraid of it." Maisie was looking at the train tracks. "Papa," she said, "are we waiting for somebody?" He looked at the tracks, the mountain, the empty platform where a year of his life had turned on one afternoon. "No," he said, "we already found everybody we need." She accepted this with a nod, as though it confirmed something she'd already believed, and then she pulled gently on his hand because she was ready to go. They walked back to the wagon, the three of them, through the town that had learned their story and revised its judgment, and was already moving on to other concerns, which was what towns did and was, in its way, the best possible outcome to no longer be a story, to simply be people living in a place. Maisie climbed up first. Lenora took his hand getting up, which she didn't strictly need to do, and didn't let go of it right away. He drove them home through the October afternoon, through the country that had tried to kill two of them and had failed, through the pines that smelled like cedar, through the gate he'd built and rebuilt over 12 years, down the road to the house where the kitchen window threw yellow light into the gathering dusk. He thought about what Maisie had said the first night in the barn. It smelled something that stayed. He had not known then, not fully, what was being built. He had known he was willing to build it, which was not the same thing. The difference between willingness and understanding was the distance you traveled by actually doing something, the gap between intending to build a thing and having built it, with all the imperfect joinery and miscalculated materials and unexpected structural requirements that actual building involved. It was not what he'd imagined when he wrote the letter. It was considerably more, not easier, more. He stopped the wagon at the house. Maisie jumped down and went immediately toward the barn. There was something in there that needed checking on. There was always something in the barn that needed checking on. And Lenora climbed down with his hands still in hers, and then stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the house, the way she sometimes did, as though still accounting for the fact that it was real. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing." She shook her head slightly. I didn't think I'd get to have this. For a long time, I genuinely didn't think so." He looked at her, at the house, at the light in the window and the mountains behind them and the sound of Maisie's voice from the barn, talking to the horses in the no-nonsense way she talked to everything. "Well," he said, "you've got it." She looked at him. "We've got it," he said. She squeezed his hand once and let go and went inside to start dinner, and he followed her in. The door closed behind them on the evening, and the mountains and the cold and everything that had tried to prevent this particular moment from existing, and inside the lamp came up, and the stove came on, and Maisie's boots appeared at the door shedding mud, and the ordinary life that had been built from extraordinary effort continued in the way of all things built well, and tended honestly not perfectly, not without difficulty, but steadily and without apology and with every intention of lasting.